Okay, so we are already recording, so you can start, Didier.
Okay, so wait 1 second, because I don't see my face anymore. I don't see anybody. But so if there's anything,
I can see your face.
Okay, so I'll try to behave nicely. Okay, so here is the idea for today. I'm sorry I've been a bit too fast and too ambitious for last time, but the basic idea that I wanted to develop is that we badly need good data, because people talk a lot about models or pseudo theories. And I think we should really pay attention to do that on the basis of good data. And the other thing that I want to develop today, that's the plan of the second course, is the following. There are some old questions that have been abandoned by most of us, including me. And by discussing with students recently at various places, some of the students are a little bit lost about what are the fundamental questions that we are addressing to when we do speech studies. So I quickly looked at a number of things that, at least when I was a student, were important, and I think they are still important today. For example, the idea of a speech code. Is there a speech code? Does this question make any sense at all? The other thing is that if there is a speech code, we should have primitives, discuss the idea of variations and invariants. Then there is another thing that I already started to talk last week, early this week, is the open or closed nature of sound systems. And I think this is a very important question if we go beyond the idea of symbolic systems. Then it obliges us to discuss the nature of variation in speech phenomena. And then there is this thing that if you work in phonetics, phonology, or whatever, we have to explain the diversity, complexity, and dynamics of sound system. It's not enough to look at it and say, oh, you have systems with a lot of sounds and they have systems with less sounds. The reason, what we have to say is why it is like that. And that is a difficult question, but that brings us immediately to the question of studying complex systems in speech and language. And then there's one little point that I want to come back on. It's not a little point. Is the idea of spontaneous speech, laboratory speech, and pathological speech. Are they different things, or are they different phases of the same phenomenon? Personally, I'm very irritated when I hear someone saying to me, oh, this is spontaneous speech, this is true speech. What you do in lab is not real speech. Well, could we say that of physicists who are studying, for example, particle physics, and say that the study of particle physics is different in the laboratory or when they consider phenomena at the end of the universe? I think the same thing. And the relation between spontaneous speech and laboratory speech is not a trivial one, but may reveal a lot of things about dynamic process, frontiers, intervals of phenomena. So that's, and I have one good example coming from pathological speech today. So I'm going to discuss that, and the immediate consequence of these things is quantification of data, measurements, accuracy, and processing. And for example, when I was a student, I worked in various famous places, but if we look at that from the point of view of today, quantification of data at that time is just a joke. We were basically showing the phenomena existing, but we didn't have really good quantified data. The problem of calibration was a problem, the number of measurements, the accuracy, all these things are not a problem anymore today. So it really changes the field, and that's the idea that I have behind all these things that I'm going to discuss with you guys. So I don't know what happens, but my screen is completely blocked. So I will stop it. And I will restart it again because I cannot.
We decided to use Zoom because of you.
No, but it's a good idea. It's just.
I know. It's just joking. Just
okay.
kidding.
I'm just, okay. So let me very quickly about speech code, primitive variations and invariants. There was a book by Joe Perkel and Dennis Klatt that's published in 1986. That's very seldom quoted today, these days, but that's a very important book, I think, because it shakes everybody when people go back to that book. It's a book about invariance variability in speech processes. So I will allow myself to make a few quotations from that will feed the discussion that we will have later. For example, Sheila Blumstein, at one point in that book, she says, well, there is acoustic invariance in the speech signal corresponding to phonetic features of natural language. The perceptual system is sensitive to these invariant properties. So it's her claim, and we will accumulate a few things, and that, as I said, it's going to feed the discussion. So Bob Port was saying at one point, and I think that's an interesting point too, the phonetic space must have certain properties of invariance in order for phonetic objects to play their role in the communicative function of language. That makes sense, in my opinion, but we have to go into details. Then Björn Lindblom was saying something in relation with what Ken Stevens was saying. It is a fundamental property of spoken language is its quantal nature. Linguistic analysis show that the sound shapes of lexical and grammatical elements are not unanalyzable wholes, but exhibit quantized organization into combination of small numbers of discrete units such as distinctive features. It makes sense for everybody, but I think it's a good point it's an important point to recall these things. And then the most surprising things that I found in that book come from Gunnar Fant. In fact, Fant was saying distinctive feature theory has two main purposes. One is to develop a language universal system of phonetic categories selected to serve phonological classificatory functions. And you can see that Fant is talking about phonology. The other is to describe essential of the speech code. And again, it's Fant speaking about the speech code. It means the distinctive dimensionalities and mechanism of encoding within the speech chain. And then he said something, the mechanism and code are a unique product of human physiology and then universal, while specific choices of classificatory features for describing a specific language become highly dependent on the investigator's phonetic background. So he's making nuances that I think even linguists wouldn't, some phoneticians wouldn't do today. So it's very, I think it's what Fant made is a very important point at that time, and it's still valuable today. And then there was Labov, who was saying in that conference about variation, the degree of categorization of phonetic substance is the main topic of linguistic inquiry. The appropriate treatment of variation remains the central problem of linguistics and phonetics. It makes sense. These are generalities, but I think they are fundamental. That's the last slide of this kind. About variability. Variability is far from random, and this is key. Many of the alternation in the acoustic form of speech sounds arise out of contextual effects which are predictable if complex. And it comes from Jeff Ellman and McClelland. The phenomenon which has been described as the lack of invariance problem, and you see why I put it in the end of this quotation, is not a problem at all for human listeners. It is precisely the variability in the signal which permits listeners to understand speech in a variety of contexts and spoken by a variety of listeners. I mean, it is absolutely for today what we do, even if you want to do machine learning of whatever, these points remain essential points that we have to address to. And I'm not sure that we still do that, certainly from linguist, phonetics and phonology. I think these things have been completely forgotten. Phonological units, and then there was Abs who disappeared for the field for bad reasons, but still he has valuable claims that we can take. Phonological units are abstract intentions which are implemented generating perceptually acceptable waveforms. And it makes basically that these guys, they were always considering, as you can see from these things, that there are two dimensions, production and perception. Phonologists today, they have a dramatic tendency to forget anything about perception. I may exaggerate, but I don't think that I exaggerate too much. And then Abs put the point on one thing that I briefly discussed 2 days ago. While speech motor control actions are related deterministically to underlying phonological units, the individual movement and muscle action are wholly subordinate to the achievement of multi-action goals. So we started by discussing this notion of variation in variability, and then we go to the lack of invariance problem, and we finish with speech motor action. So the whole picture is there, and anybody who wants to go back to that discussion, I highly recommend to go to the book that Joe Perkele and Dennis Klatt has published, because it's really an important book for the field. And so let's go quickly to the open or closed nature of sound systems. So you have consonants, for example, I choose the bilabial consonants because it's an easy thing to do, but it will make my point, I think. Consonants involving lips are the first to be acquired by children. The complexification of these consonants follow a pattern similar to speech acquisition of children. So for example, you have etc. And you can see that gradually they complexify from nasals to stops to fricatives to approximants. And so what we have is that the development of motor skills follows. The jaw and lips form a simple control unit in the early stage of babbling. And then the mandible and the lower lip are at that time highly correlated, and the upper lip is very much involved in swallowing and orally behaves in a more or less independent way. And look at the thing that we have here, just taking into consideration lips. Then after what I just mentioned, there is a differentiation between the lower and upper lips toward actions, but independent in relation to lip gestures. This leads to a more complex production of sounds, and just taking into consideration sounds produced by the lips, we have the pattern that you can see here, and these reflect, I think, something that when we discuss the issue of complexification of complexity in speech is important, is that when you have a complexification process, and if it's not automatic or pre-encoded, we have phases of differentiation, then the result of differentiation is integrated, and then it's expanded or refined. And I will show you a very good example in relation with clicks and swallowing very, very quickly. So if you look at the complexification of place of articulation and manner of articulation for lips, you can have this kind of pattern here, and going from nasals to stops to fricatives to approximants to trills to flaps and to clicks. And then you can have within each of the categories have refines, like for example here for voiceless bilabial stop, ejective, aspirated, labialized, and all these things is a complexification of what is accounted for by lip movements and lip control, because lip motor actions, if you want. Here is the example that I wanted to discuss and present to you about the relation between swallowing and clicks. And this is very interesting because it may reverse completely the way we look at clicks in the world's languages. And the idea is the following. I took it from a collaboration that I have with Brian Gick and his group at the University of Vancouver. Brian came here in Paris, and we had a lot of discussion around it. And so he's developing his own things, and we are extending that here. And so it says the following thing: a theory of embodied phonetics specifies that we learn to build and control an inventory of highly specialized body parts. Makes sense, I think. The productions of clicks that you have here, ejectives that you have here, and labiodorsal consonants that are single consonants but with two symbols, is based on the reuse and specialization of body movements made during swallowing mechanism. So if you look at the swallowing mechanism that's taken from a standard book of physiology, you have a closure here in front of the vocal tract, a closure here in the back part of the vocal tract in the initial phase of swallowing, and here you have what medical doctors or physiologists call a bolus. It can be water, it can be food, or whatever that you have here. And look at what happened in the phases of a palatal click. That's a symbol for the palatal click. You have the gradual increase of this pocket of air between the front and the back closure. But then I will show you the movement of what happens with the back closure. So here you have a complete closure. Then you have the gradual increase of this pocket of air that results, in fact, from the lowering of the jaw and from the backward movement of the back part of the tongue. I would say the tongue dorsum, but there's the tongue dorsum and the tongue root too, up to the point that you will have initially at this point at 60 milliseconds here, or between 60 and 80, the front closure is released, and you will have this more or less this sound. And then if you release the back part, you will have something that like the click components that are uvula or vela or whatever. So I have MRI data that are taken from a sequence of image because I think it's easier to look at in a presentation. Backward movement, so this is the movement for the palatal click. And here you have the backward movement of the tongue when you have this propulsive phase that the propulsion of the food or alimentary bolus, and here its case is saliva. You have the saliva here in the pharyngeal part that you can see, and at one point you can see the saliva going down in the esophagus. That's here. And then in the reverse phase that you have, so this is the initial phase, and the reverse phase that you have between 5 and 8, the rising of the laryngeal part here that you can see. And then what you have here is gradually this disclosure that you have here. So there is one backward movement and one upward movement. The backward movement is reuse of swallowing in our hypothesis to produce clicks, and the upward movement is the reuse of the return of this mechanism to produce ejective consonants. So we're trying to falsify and to destroy our hypothesis, not to look too ridiculous if we try to publish that. But I think this is an interesting hypothesis that claims that the emergence of clicks as phonemes in Africa could represent a late episode in the diversification of human languages sound systems, not the traces of ancient savages. This is the contrary. The emergence of clicks is the development of stronger independence among the formerly tightly structured swallowing, and this refers to the process whereby new functional units, clicks or non-pulmonic consonant phonemes, are created by incorporating a new behavior into existing stable behaviors. And this is also the refinement in the ongoing modification of existing behavior toward a more integrated model. And so the conclusion of that is that the emergence of clicks in Khoisan is also occurring, and that there are interesting historical questions linked to that. The emergence of click in Khoisan is also occurring in an area where a great diversity of sound and system is found, and where therefore the possibility for the emergence of greater complexification of sound and sound system exists or is already present, if you want. If you go back to these maps that were given by some colleagues of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig of anthropological evolution, you have a map of genetic diversity that the greater genetic diversity that you have for human population is here. And if you go to South America, you have a gradual decrease of genetic diversity, with some exceptions in South and Central America for what we call, for example, Mixtec population or Andean people. But that's not our point today. The point is that there's also something that in parallel to that is that the mean phonemic diversity across language families. The clearer the things on the African continent is where you have the greater phonemic diversity. And then the more you go far, you go from Africa, the less phonetic diversity you have. There are exceptions that are not taken into consideration, and I'm very critical about that point myself, is that Central America and the Andes show a phonemic diversity that's much greater than what we found in the lowlands of South America. But it all depends on what we say about phonemic diversity, and I will illustrate that very quickly today. The other point is discussing the nature of variation of speech phenomena. So I will come back to this idea of phonemic diversity with one good example a little bit later, but I just delayed the thing because there were other things to be discussed at the same point. The nature of variation of speech phenomena. These are not humans. Don't worry, I'm not crazy, or not crazy yet about thinking that they are similar to humans. There is a correlation between the evolution of morphology and vocal signal structure. And one very good parallel of that is given by Darwin's features of the Galapagos Islands. This is a work that has been done by an ornithologist that is working very regularly in Brazil. It is Jeff Podos, and I think he still works in Brazil now. He's there since ages, and he has done absolutely incredible work in ornithology and the bioacoustics of birds. But basically what Jeff has showed is that you have a different acoustic signature according to the form of the beak. This finch eats pernilongos, and this one eats nuts. So he has a stronger beak, and this one has a smaller beak, and you can see that the acoustic signature are different. So there is no deterministic thing in that. It's just there is an adaptation to the form of beak according to the type of food that you have. What do we have for humans? There was an initial suggestion that was made by Dan Dediu and Bob Ladd, who suggested a relationship between the distribution of tone languages and two brain growth and development related genes, the ISPM and microcephaly. For a long time, it has been severely criticized, and even Ladd and Dediu were saying, well, maybe what the results of our work is comparing matchboxes with human genes and or human tones. But eventually, recently, there was a fantastic paper published in Science that was showing that they were probably right in claiming that, but it takes too much time to discuss it in detail, so I can go back to that discussion if you want a little bit later. But the conclusion of this is that one possible explanation to understand aspects of phonetic variation and universal is to take into account biological, and then you have genetic and anatomical factors. And for example, one fantastic example that's very easy to show is that about the correlated evolution of morphology and the vocal signature. There's one example that was given and remains unnoticed today that was presented by Peter Ladefoged at one of the ICPHS conferences in 1984. That was Copenhagen, if I'm not mistaken. There's differences between the vowel systems of Yoruba and Italian may have biological basis. And basically what Ladefoged was saying, the two systems have the same amount of vowels, but there is a different distribution in the F1 and F2 space, given the shape of the lips of an average Italian and Yoruba. So it was at that time even more politically incorrect than today. So people just don't want to hear that. But that's just trivial. It says that you have people bigger and smaller, and that is it, and there's nothing else behind that. And then there was this work done by Tony Trail and Hiroshi Nakagawa, who showed that most, the name of the guy here, have no alveolar ridge. So the alveolar ridge is the little riddles that you have here. If you look at what San do, and so you have the name of five Bushmen that Tony worked with, and you see here that, well, let's take that's easier. You have the palate vault, and you have no alveolar ridge here. If you have an alveolar ridge like you and I have, it's a little bump that you have here. So San people don't seem to have that, unless exceptionally, maybe for this guy, but most of the time, and Nakagawa took 20 more speakers, and recently I made the same thing with the Hadza in Tanzania, and the tendency seems to be respected, but I want to cross-check what I have done in the thing. So why is it interesting? There is no deterministic thing. There is no, if you have no alveolar ridge, you're not producing sounds that other people can't do. So the association with no alveolar ridge and clicks is wrong. But the thing is that from an historical point of view, there might have been acoustic variations that have been taken into consideration to shape phonetic and phonological systems. And there that becomes interesting. And for example, one of the things that, well, I'm working with these two groups of guys here, the Hadza and the Sandawe now. And the guys that Tony was working is among this group of Ta and the other one, Hana, here for Hiroshi Nakagawa. And so the question is, what does it mean if Sandawe Hadza have or don't have an alveolar ridge? If they have an alveolar ridge, it means that anatomically they are similar to the other San people, But we know now by genetic studies that they have been separated since 10 or 15,000 years, which gives a time scale that's interesting to look to compare. If they have it, if they don't have it, then they have it or don't have it, sorry. If they have it as the South African ones, the same population, if they don't have it, something has happened in 10 or 15,000 years, which means that details of the anatomy linked to the speech production system might have an influence on acoustic variation and not deterministic factors in the speech production system. So that is an interesting case to study. So the other point that we can look at is go back to Bjorn Lindblom and Ian Madison, who took, Madison's phonetic and phonological database, and they basically said there are 3 levels of complexity in sound system: basic, elaborate, and complex. Basic system is like in the Hawaiian, and I just took the presence of bilabial consonants, but I will go back to the entire system. So Hawaiian has only 2 labials. If you look at Kahitiana, you have many more. If you look at Mangbetu, you have a lot. If you look at Mandarin, you have less. And if you look at Hadza in Tanzania, you have this amount of thing. And if you look at Kon, you have that. Tony would be angry at me if I don't do that, but there are variations, and these are the variations, and they are not random. So this is completely crazy system. Of course, I agree, but it means that this increase in complexity is a tendency, and that we have to try to understand that and integrate that in our interpretation of how sound system work. Take a basic system as Kahitiana in Brazil. We are in Brazil, so I want to take an example of Brazilian language. And Kahitiana is very interesting. You have this amount of consonants, not many, and you have this amount of vowel timbres, 5. If I think in total, it makes 15 or 14 phonemes. But then you can increase the number of vowels by including nasalization and duration. And so what you have is 4 nasals, but you have 28 allophones. There is an increase in phonological categories. That's what we were discussing with Thais the other day. 5 vowels, but length and nasalization contrast make that you have 20 vowels. So is it a system with 16 or 39 phonological categories? It all depends if you integrate allophones as phonological categories or if you don't put them. And that is an important question that in the new challenges, that is not even debated in phonology today. Look at a system, it's not basic system with 28 consonants. I made a mistake here, so forgot about this line on top here. I made a bad cut and paste thing. So, but you have here a type of complex consonants, labiovelars. You have all these consonants that you have here that are prenasalized consonants, and prenasalized consonants plus implosives and the labiovelar, you have to produce these sounds elaboration of consonant gestures. An elaboration of the consonant gesture, if you take P and B, a simple consonant gesture, you put an implosive, you have the lowering of the larynx, in addition of making the bilabial closure and the vibration of the vocal folds. If you make that with a prenasalized, you have, for example, here, you have to add a prenasal part. This is not a sequence. This is part of the same phonological unit. And you can do that with trills, that the capital B that you have, that basic. I will come back to that in a second. And then you have the complex system where you have in this crazy that's spoken in Namibia, you have 89 consonants, 41 pulmonic, 48 non-pulmonic, 5 vowel timbres, and you have 21 vocalic categories, and you have 4 tones. And then people will say, well, they might be simple from a syntactic point of view. Forget about that. They are as crazy in the syntax as they are in phonetics and phonology. So these are pulmonic consonants, these are non-pulmonic consonants, and this is the vowel system. And you have 4 tones. So complex system in Lindblom's and Madison's idea was complexification of elaborate gestures, clicks and glottalization, clicks and aspiration, affricated consonants and glottalization. So there are ways to describe that. But again, we go back to this pattern of complexification, which I think is an interesting one. Very quickly now, thresholds in aerodynamic and acoustic parameters that I have been discussing slightly with the case of nasalized fricative 2 days ago. One very good example to this idea of threshold that is very precious for engineers and physicists, if you say a sentence like this one, Mon ami Mario Rossi m'a traité de bredin. So R is a uvular trill that you have in French. You have here subglottal pressure and you have intraoral pressure here. What you can see from subglottal pressure and intraoral pressure is that slightly before the uvular trill, you have a slight increase in subglottal pressure, and you have 3 up and down movements of intraoral pressure. Same thing for the second one. So basically, if you want to produce a Bernoulli effect with the uvula, you have to maintain a pressure differential between intraoral pressure and atmospheric pressure for an amount of time in order to make the uvula vibrate. And this is done above a certain threshold. And the threshold is about 2 hectopascal. And the duration of these things is about 100 milliseconds. So I showed that for the alveolar trill the other day. So this is a spectrogram illustrating that. I will go quickly on that. Then you have, you can make measurements of the values, for example, of maximal intraoral pressure for P, B, 8 and 3 hectopascal. And then you have the trills. You have, for example, for the voice trill, brr, you have about 4 times what you have for the non-trilled, and for the voiceless, brr, what you have is 3 times. And you can even have a prenasalized trill. So all this can be measured and studied. There are things that I don't really have the time to discuss now, but again, if someone is interested, I can keep it for the discussion. But the point that I want to illustrate now is the following thing, is that again, you have the oscillation of the lips above a certain threshold. And the threshold here is about 10 hectopascal or something like that. And you need also to have the superimposition of the lip oscillation with the configuration for the back vowel U in that case. And the 2 things allow to generate a Bernoulli effect in the vocal tract, given you respect the fact that you respect the aerodynamic conditions. Here is another example. We have me pru, pru, so, and this is a common word, and this is a tense marker, the bru. So this is not someone coughing or sneezing. This is really common words. And again, the threshold of vibration is above 10 hectopascal. Now look at that. If you want to have an idea of thresholds and how it works, you will have the illustration of a bilabial trill. It's a movie made with 300 images per second of someone, of a child, but whatever. This is Sarah, our daughter, that wanted to try that when we got the camera. But the important thing that I want to show you is lip oscillation. And lip oscillation is not only the lip oscillation. You have the volumes of the cheeks and the compliance of the cheeks that's changing at the same time. Look at that. So this is the end of the first vibration. So she will prepare now for the second thing. So remember, it's 300 images per second. So here it is. She's going to close the lips. Here it is. And then for the lip vibration, you can see that the cheeks are oscillating at the same time, or it's not really in phase with what we have for the lips. And you can also see that a very strong lip protrusion and lip spreading at the same time. And it shows, it shows the following thing. If you put that, I didn't do that to your daughter, don't worry, I did that on myself, measuring subglottal pressure and intraoral pressure when you produce brr. What you can see here is that when you have the oscillation in intraoral pressure, you have slight oscillation in subglottal pressure, and you have also a serious increase in subglottal pressure when you do that. And so what it reflects is that the vocal tract compliance, or elasticity if you want, when you have a valley here, it corresponds to a peak there, and vice versa. And so it means that there is an influence of the changes in volume inside the vocal tract with changes in pressure. And these things all play a role in the phenomena that we are studying. And so these things also play a role to maintain, for example, pressure above a certain threshold for a certain time. If it would be only stiff cheeks, it wouldn't work in the same way. So that there are a number of things that are important to understand like that. And then, so threshold is about quantal change. And there's another aspect of quantal change that I can very quickly illustrate to you, is the change from alveolar to uvular R. It is an historical change important for Dutch, even in Portuguese, French, and many other languages, but they didn't have a very satisfactory account until very recently. And in fact, it is very simple. And once you have found the solution, you have here an ultrasound images where you can see the tongue tip is here and the tongue dorsum is here, okay? So what you can see is that the tongue dorsum is rather posterior in the three cases. And what you have here is the gradual lowering of the tongue tip and tongue blade. And so if it goes too low, what happens? Go back to the good old nomograms of Font. Normally, when you make an alveolar trill, you have F3 and F4 that are approximated. If the tongue tip and the tongue blade goes too low or open too much, then the effect is that F3 will go down, F4 will not change much, but then you will have also changes on the other four ones. And it means that this pole that you have here will not be present for the speakers. But if you maintain the tongue dorsum in the position, there is another F3, F4 pole that is here, situated at the backside of the vocal tract. And it is exactly what accounts, what happens is that if you lose the F3, F4 pole in the front part of the vocal tract, perceptually people will reinterpret the F3, F4 with the tongue dorsum in the back position, and that will be recognized as a uvular trill. I made a long story short, but if you want, there is a paper that I can gladly send to you about that. Another point, and I will keep my time, honey, don't worry. It's about diphthongs, vowel dispersion and breaking in one of these crazy savages languages from the northwest of Holland. I love to say savages when I like the language, as you all have noticed. So please don't blame me for my politically incorrectness. So, for example, in this language, you have here a word that's a word for floor, is flyer. And if you add a plural suffix or a diminutive suffix in the word here, stien, and there's chinche, that's a small stone, what you will have is that a falling diphthong will become a rising diphthong. That's what people call a breaking diphthong. And one good illustration of that is the following. You have the ear, you have E followed by a schwa. And if you look at F2 and F1, in fact, what happens is that F2, the E vowel that you have here is in fact masking the real formants of the schwa. That is rather like the high non-tense vowel that you have in English, hid in English, something like that. So at one point, if you diminish the first part of the diphthong, or suddenly what was a falling diphthong will become a rising diphthong. You will have a transition with the pattern of the second vowel that is in fact really interpreted as this one. There are perceptual studies that have been done on that. And so this is really exciting to look at these things about perceptual thresholds to reinterpret phenomena that are quite complex about these diphthongs. By the way, this language has 29 vowels. And let's go back to some crazy system with vowels that we have in South America. It's the language called Nasa-Yue that's spoken in Colombia, where you have 4 vocalic timbres, E, A, U, but you can have 32 phonological vowels. The oral vowels can be short, they can be long, they can be aspirated, and then can be glottal. And people say, oh, glottal vowel, what is it? I'm going to show it to you. And you have the same pattern for nasals. So just to have an idea of what we are going to look at quickly now, you put a fibroscope through the nose of someone behind the velum, and you have the hanging camera here that shows you the vocal folds, that's valve number 1. You have the ventricular folds, that's valve number 2, and you have the epiglottic folds, valve number 3. And this is to account for this, that you have 3 valves, one on top of the other. And you have here, I showed you the other day, the laryngeal articulator model. So I don't want to come back on that. But the important thing to remember for the discussion that we have is that you have 3 valves, 1, 2, 3, and then one on top of the other. So there's a vertical dimension in that. And I will show you with one speaker that we made come to Paris because it was impossible to do in Colombia. And he was happy to be in Paris. Don't worry, I don't have any wanted on my back if I go to Colombia. The Indians were very happy when they came to do this work here. So you will hear the guy producing E 3 times, E nasal, E aspirated, aspirated nasal, glottal, and glottal nasal, and then we will discuss that. So here it is. We took the E vowel because in the E vowel, the pharynx is wide and it's easier and less obtrusive than if you do that with a vowel like A or U or something like that. So here it is.
E, E,
Nasal.
E, 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 E,
Aspirated.
E, E,
Aspirated nasal.
E, 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 E,
Glottal.
E,
Glottal nasal.
E, E.
Okay. So why is it interesting? Well, if you look at the thing here for the glottal vowel that has been discussed and contested, it is the following thing. You have the ventricular bands that are inserted on top of the vocal folds. And if you look very carefully here, the image that here is taking the middle part of the vowel. You have the EGG signal and the acoustic signal here. Then you can see this little split that you have here shows you the vocal folds. It's a little bit obvious 40 milliseconds later that you have here. And so what happens is that when you produce a glottal vowel, you have the ventricular bands that are almost closing the space between in the vocal tract, but there's still a vibrating glottis. What is really surprising is that there are no interference of the ventricular bands with the vocal folds. And if you close completely, as you have here, you can see that you don't see the vocal folds. And now we had a kind of proof of what we were doing, which is an extremely exciting case. One of the guys that came to Paris had a paralysis, unilateral paralysis of one vocal fold, and he wanted to know what was about his special voice. He has a harsh voice. That's the only thing. He produces everything normally. There has no problem at all. But this vocal fold cannot move. So what happens is the following thing. If you look at the audio waveform here, you can see that it is perturbated. This is the result of the harsh voice. You can see that the EGG signal is less, the amplitude is very small. It's still there, but it's much small. There's only one vocal fold vibrating, that vibrating by an approximation of the stiff vocal fold. And so, for example, if you want to make a glottal vowel, the ordinary one, what you have here is the approximation of the stiff the vocal fold that doesn't vibration is on the right side of your screen. And then there is an approximation from the left side, okay? And so that's what makes that you have, at this point here, some oscillation of the vocal folds. So what happens, something I lost again my screen. It's also always at the crucial point. I'm coming back, don't worry. Okay, and we are about at the end, so there will be no delay because of that. Here it is. Okay, so we go back to that slide. And so what happens here is the following thing. We have the compensated glottal vowel. So the normal vowel is here, and you have the compensated glottal vowel here. So what the guy is doing is simply in the first phase approximating this active part here from the stiff part. And you can see that it's pretty similar. And what he's doing is just in the three valves that you have valve 1 remains valve 1, vocal folds. But instead of using valve 2, which are the ventricular bands, it changed valve 2 for valve 3. So the ventricular band are substituted, the aryepiglottic folds are substituted to the ventricular bands. So this is a fantastic case of adaptation, of physiological adaptation to continue to produce normal sound. The guy has a simple harsh voice and there is nothing special about that. So just to finish now, to tease you a little bit and put maybe start a discussion about this thing, or make the discussion a little bit more contemporary, despite the fact that I'm taking that quotation from George Lyell. Lyell was a geologist who was one of Darwin's master, and he was making the following observation discussing of the origin of language. No language seems to be able to last more than a few hundred years, while species evolve over hundreds of thousands of years. For Lyell, the forms of speech seems constantly under the pressure of change, and none of them are meant to last. This leads him to ask the question of the definition of a language. It looks like a joke, but I think it's very profound what he's saying. Lastly, if this theory of indefinite modifiability be sound, what meaning can we attach to the term language, and what definition can be given of it so as to distinguish a language from a dialect? And I think that quotation is anything but trivial. And for example, if we go back, this is the last slide of the presentation. If we go back to the discussion, it brings us back to the discussion that is very important today, and I don't want to contest that at all, is that how to model the variation and propagation of sound change. How do people who do machine learning integrate variation in their models? And you know, there's a lot of things like that that we can take into account by integrating various things that I have been discussing too. And there is one equation that is used by people doing population ecology model that is almost too simple to describe that thing, but there are various forms of the equation that it's another purpose, but that we can state in the following form. And this equation has a very simple phonological interpretation. The quantity that you have here, k minus n divided by k, is the fraction of the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity of the environment to transport the elements, that is to distinguish them in the perceptual space when we talk about phonological systems. That was not taken into account by individuals who share the same phonological system. And this amount represents a fraction of the total noise discrimination possibilities of the speakers. And the logistic equation is then obtained by multiplying the initial degree of increase R by the discriminative possibilities of sound. So I just don't want to go in too many details now, but the point that I want to say is that there exist tools in the field and in field outside of us that are extremely powerful and simple at the same time that could help us to integrate this idea of variation, propagation, and see how we could account for that and match what we do in speech with what people do in other scientific disciplines by using the same tools. And I think this is the key point. And then the conclusion, sometimes the students at the end of the year, they said, well, all this to do what? Why not? After all, we have to work for that. I think one of the points that I wanted to develop in these two presentations is the following point. We do, first of all, fundamental research. So we want to understand how speech works in languages. That is the fundamental issue. Then there are various points of view. We can understand the ontogeny and phylogenies of speech, questions of evolution. We can understand the history of languages, the example that I gave you in Africa. We want to help to treat deficits, Parkinson's disease, compensation, reinnervation, or whatever. We want to contribute to automatic speech processing, translation, synthesis, recognition, the machine learning things. And we want to teach and learn languages. I had a student who made a nice PhD, but eventually I gave him the idea about presenting that because I had no time, but he did that using Peter Birkhoff's model. But I think all this makes sense if we start by saying, by knowing very clearly what we want to do in the field. And we should stop once and for all by putting ourselves, I'm not criticizing the engineers that are here, but I'm criticizing the linguists, and probably including me, is that we have once and for all to stop to consider language and speech as a purely symbolic system. This is a grounded biological system, and if we don't take that into consideration, we will stay in this kind of pre-Galilean state that we are sometimes when we discuss the things of our field. So here it is. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to open to respond to any critics or whatever. Thank you.
Didier, thank you a lot. It was an extremely interesting talk. My final note in my notebook here is there is a large number of interesting questions raised by Didier. I will not have time to tackle all of them, but they are really, the first questions were really open, so and it's really hard to deal with them, cope with them. I will open now for questions from the others because I myself have a lot of questions, but it would be selfish from my part to start. So any questions? There is something in the chat here. I have questions. Rafael, please.
Okay, so thank you, Didier, for this very, very interesting talk. Very, very informative. And so I actually have two questions, but I will ask one now and then let the others ask.
Yeah, it's better to do one by one.
Yeah, and then I can come back later. Yeah. So just a thing to be sure that what you said is exactly what I heard. Yeah? And it's about the clicks in Africa. So this reminds me a very, very known theory that is the conservatism of peripheral regions. You know this. This is very, very, very common in linguistics. So people said that the colonies are more conservative than the metropoles, and this is true also for culture. Because if you take Eurasia, for example, if you take the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia is there where they invented agriculture, writing, and then some things like patriarchy and religion, which are things that we think are conservative, but actually they are innovations, actually. And then the people that were in periphery, in Philippines or in Great Britain, they were the primitive ones, actually. And even in cultural terms, that may explain the liberalism of the Anglo-Saxon people. But anyway, coming back to phonetics, what you're saying is that the fact that you have clicks in Africa, clicks are maybe the innovation. They are the new things, because this is what you're saying.
Yeah,
okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Because, okay, because people tend to say, oh, clicks is a very ancient thing because it happens only in Africa. So this means it was the ancient way of communicating, and then we lost that, and then and maybe it's exactly the contrary you're saying. Huh? It's clicks are innovative, yeah, actually.
Look, there are two things to be said about it, not to take the word for too long. There is no link between clicks and genetics, because that was the work that was done by Chris Knight and other people who were saying there is a link between Bushmen who are representative of archaic features of the genetics of mankind, and therefore and clicks should be the sounds of the first humans. But we have no way to prove that. There is absolutely no way to prove that at all. So the thing is that maybe there is another way to consider the hypothesis, is to simply say, okay, what we can propose, and if you make a new the complexification hypothesis, it takes into account the second point that I wanted to do, is that clicks, they occur at various places in the world. I mean, you have clicks in Africa, but you and I, we are producing clicks every day. We don't categorize them. You know, if you're angry at someone, you mean, and you want to, and if you want to imitate a horse, and all these things, we do that all the time. It has to be integrated in the sound system. So I don't claim that my hypothesis is the good one, but I think that associating clicks with all features of mankind, I don't think that it is, there is no way to prove that. And there are other arguments around that in terms of sound propagation and things like that. And in the other sound system, for example, people say, oh, clicks are special. Okay. If you look at the labiovelar consonant that I briefly mentioned for Mangbetu, there are hundreds of languages of Africa who have labiovelar consonant. And the mechanism of initiation is velaric airstream mechanism too. So if you associate clicks and velaric airstream mechanism and labiovelars with velaric airstream mechanism, there's not only a few sign languages spoken in South Africa and then a couple of them in Tanzania. You have hundreds of languages in sub-Saharan Africa who have this initiation sound mechanism. And that makes the story completely different. And again, the labiovelars is a reuse of, or is a possible reuse of swallowing. But that's another paper. I have a paper about it. I can send it to you, Rafael, if you want.
This is great. Yeah, just a final comment. I think that John Ohala has a paper about pentatonic clicks in French.
Yeah.
I remember vaguely this. Yeah. So
Alain Marshall did that too at one point.
Yeah, this confirms what you're saying. Okay, thanks. I will ask the other question later.
No, you can. Do you want to ask the other question now? You can do it. You are
no, if there are someone with questions, I will let.
Go ahead. Ask the second question. It's okay.
It's okay. It's just a comment. It's about what you said in the last, so in the first part of your course, and we repeat it this time. Anyway, it's this thing about the models, and I remember a conversation that I had with Shinji Maeda many years ago, and I was just saying to him, it was a decade ago, I think, and I said to him, "Oh, your model is the most used model in the domain, in the field," and then he said, "No, it's the most abused model in the field." And I think I understand what he wanted to say, and this makes sense with what we're saying. The problem with for example, the Maeda models that was used, I used this in my thesis and later as well. The problem is that the people tend then to use the Maeda model, which was done from a single subject with a couple of sentences. It's very, very limited as a explanatory power, actually. And then the people started just abusing that model, and then the model substituted the reality at some point. I think that's the danger. That's the real danger in our domain, actually, is that when the model starts substituting the reality. And I think that models should be used in very, very parsimonious way, just as you showed
this is the only thing. You got the point, Rafael. This is the only thing that I want to emphasize. Maybe I did exaggerate the word that I was using.
No. I think you are totally right. Yeah.
But I think the thing is that people tend to worship models. I use Maeda model. I use a kind of model, and the models. And Shinji has a very good expression for that. He said, "You know what? A model, it is like a screwdriver. If you need to have a flat one or a crossed one, you use the appropriate one to do what you have to do, and the rest has no importance."
It's a tool.
And I think it's just a tool, and we have to avoid to worship models. But we have to talk with people who do models, because linguists had a tendency, for example, the fights that we have that you know very well between linguists and people from Grenoble in France were totally unrealistic. They were fighting because
be careful what you say.
But I've been there, so I have the right to criticize.
But it's okay. Don't worry.
I'm still good level.
No. But the thing is that
right,
people were doing, at one point, models, and they were, pushing these models very far. And then there were people saying, it's only models, you don't know anything about data. But this is not the point. We have to put people who do models and say, look, the data that we acquired shows that there might be some subtleties that the model doesn't have. And then by talking to each other, we improve models, and we force linguists to improve the quality of their data collection too. Because it's not data is trivial and the model says everything. It's the two things are important. That's the only point that I wanted to make.
No, you're fully right. A final point about this, about model. I don't want that this will be a dialogue between the two of us. I shouldn't stop talking, but just a final point is that the people tend also to think that models are necessarily complicated. And you know, even if you take a bunch of data, you compute a mean, this is a model. It's a linear model, you know. If you do a regression, it's a model too. And then the problem is that people tend to over complexify things without need, and that's some point that is very dangerous too in our domain. So anyway, I stop now.
Okay, thank you very much, Rafael. We have Eleonora with her hand raised. Eleonora, can you ask the question or make a comment? I don't know.
Well, it's just a further comment on what has been discussed by Rafael and Didier. I'm inviting Didier to elaborate on the quality of the models, because there are models and models, and Chintu Maeda's model is a very grounded one on you know, physical facts about speech, and that's one thing. And there are models that are just too generic and abstract. So you sometimes talk about models that that are real physical models. For example, last time you were insisting on a funds model, and I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on that, because everybody seems to own a model today.
Okay, I don't own any model, so I'm too
you do not. You know, we go back to
no, I think
very grounded and some historical things that work. Why should we invent fancy models or adapt fancy models? So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I wanted to say, I mean, when you talk about font, you have this source filter model that has been a little, I think, improved by the fact that you have the laryngeal articulator model that changes the source. It's just something that's added. It doesn't say font model is idiotic. It complexifies or refines. I think I prefer the word refinement. And then, for example, for the nomograms, up to today, I haven't found anything better than using nomograms when I have acoustic recordings and I want to have an idea of what it is. But the thing is that font had a theory, and that is the key point in font, because that's a theory, and a theory has a universal, between brackets, predictive power, which a model doesn't have. A model simulates reality given a number of features or parameters. And for example, I've been trying to redevelop Jonah Harris and Muller and Brown model for the aerodynamics. And I have to say that I have, in French, we say lamentablement échoué, because simply I don't make it. I have the data to make a model, I have the thing, but I should work with people, and that's what I do now, to tell you the truth, that I'm trying to work with physicists who are better than me on doing that. But one of the new features too that we were discussing to follow the discussion that Rafael has initiated and with you is that there are numerical simulations that we can do that up to the time of Font and Maeda that were not really done. For example, now, if you have a good set of data and people who are able to modelize things, we can make numerical simulations. And this really changes the way we look at a number of phenomena. But it's outside the competence of someone like me anyway. But by putting yourself with a good physicist who study fluid dynamics, we can do the things. I can just make you one thing, and I think everybody can understand that. You take the vocal tract, you have a high pressure in the vocal tract, you close you take the vocal tract, you close the lips, and you make, and people say, oh, that's when you open the lips, there is a burst that is the product of the aerodynamic difference between pharyngeal pressure and atmospheric pressure. Okay, where does this burst come from? How is it produced? Well, that is because you open your lips. It's opening your lips, creating such a noise, it is rather a kind of shock wave. But if you want to make the model of the shock wave and you want to make a numerical simulation of that, you don't need to have a little idiot like me. You really need someone who's able to simulate that in fluid dynamics with everything in the mathematical tools that behind that. And I can't do that. So we have to associate ourselves with engineers, physicists, and make the thing progress. But just think about that issue. All the explosions that we have, that we sometimes call bursts, where do they come from? Differences in pressure, in pharyngeal pressure and atmospheric pressure, pharyngeal pressure and subglottal pressure. But these explosions, they have a physical reason. But it's not by opening the lips or by opening releasing two articulators that you do that. It's an aeroacoustic phenomenon. And try to find in the literature that we have in phonetics, in experimental phonetics and speech, someone who really talks about it. Chris Shadle has been discussing slightly these things. And maybe Shirley, I'm not sure that I remember well the thing, but these things about shock waves, it's very interesting because if we really understand that, and if it's true, then we have the simplest possible thing to explain the thing. There's a complicated mathematics and physics behind that, but that would be very simple to explain. But we still have to say why it happens and how it happens. So that's, sorry, I'm talking too much today.
We have a little
Thank
bit
you, thank you, Didier.
I'm very disappointed that you don't know the Navier-Stokes equations, Didier.
That's the goal of my life, Raphael.
You have still a couple of years to learn that.
No, but you know that the
right model for us.
Navier-Stokes equation is a millennium problem. You know that? I discovered that very recently. That the guy.
I was expecting that you come with the solution of the Navier-Stokes.
No.
General form. Okay.
It's a millennium problem. There's a few problems in science that are considered millennium problems, and the solution of the Navier-Stokes equation is one of the millennium problems.
Exactly.
I was not ambitious enough when I started to do science in the university.
Well, thank you a lot, Eleonora and Didier. I have just a few comments before we go to the next session. First of all, I like very much when you consider the question of speech being an open or closed system or process. You said a nice criticism about phonology, that phonology seems to forget about perception, which is something really important. I noticed it clearly once you said it. Then I like your idea of complexification, and seems to be the evidence that you gave in the talk are, in my opinion, very consistent, and how the thing evolves. That map that you made with the complexity of languages from Africa to the rest of the world is, how did you get that map?
Well, I fell in the soup when I was small. In fact, I started to work on African languages, so that's why I became interested in that, if I understand well your question.
No, but then there is a map where you try to, you propose that as you go far and far away from Africa, languages become less complex. That's it?
There is a few papers. There are a few papers published by Quentin Atkinson. One of them has been published in Science, if I'm not mistaken. And this is the guy who is a New Zealand guy who was working in collaboration with people from the Max Planck Institute on Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. These papers are now about, well, 8 to 10 years, something like that. But if you write Quentin Atkinson, you will find very easily the reference. And if you can't find them, I will gladly send them.
And in one final point, Raphael and Eleonora discussed many things, but when you compare genetic evolution and language evolution, and your final point, say, a language and a dialect are the same thing because, as far as I understand, both of them change too quickly. Language is a soft process, so it's natural to expect that changes really, really fast. And our time scale is something that we should not forget. 1,000 years is nothing when you think about the process of evolution. If it's in genetics, it's nothing. But even in culture or anything related to culture, it's a short time. And as our lifespan is too short, it's sometimes difficult for us to understand how quickly things change. So what we have is a photograph basically of the process that is changing. And I'd like to talk more about this with you in some moment. But at this moment, if we don't have more questions, I think—
There is a question by Maria Cantoni.
Maria Cantoni has a question. Yes, sorry. There is.
Hi, Didier.
Time, but we must have your question. No, we have time, Maria. Go ahead.
Hi, Didier. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. My question is about symmetry, and I'm sorry if you mentioned it, but or if I lost it. But I was wondering how the symmetry fits in the complexity scenario you built for us here in this presentation. If it does.
What do you mean by symmetry?
Symmetry, the very classic and old premise of phonological premise of symmetry, tendency for symmetry, because I couldn't help but notice in the vowel system you showed us from Colombia that we have a strong tendency for symmetry in the vowels, right? They are all a symmetric system.
Give us an example.
For example, we see that all the vowels, they happen in the same classes, and we have a very strict symmetric vowel system in this sense.
Okay, I see. I think that you shouldn't use the word symmetric. It's probably the dispersion of the vowel in the F1, F2 space. And there is this, if I understand well your question, I think the word symmetry may not be completely appropriate, but if you have 3 vowels, you have I, U, A. If you have 4 vowels, you have I, E, A, U. And if you have 5 vowels, you have I, E, A, O, U, and so forth. So this has been done by, a lot of people. Björn Lindblom has started that, and it's at the beginning of the dispersion theory. The interesting thing of the dispersion theory is that it takes into account perceptual aspects of the, the discrimination between vowels. And to respond to, if I understood well, what you said too about this language Nasa Yue, what is interesting with the language, it has only 4 vowel timbres. So I, E, A, U, which fits Lindblom's predictions about the distribution of vowels, but you can increase the number of phonological categories by just using lengths to make contract, using nasalization, using glottalization, using aspiration. And the same thing happened with, for example, with the San people of South Africa, where they have more than 20 vowels and they have only 5 vowel timbres. And they also use additional dimensions or additional features, if you want, to produce various types of vowels. Did I answer your question, Maria?
Yes, but I think I was thinking towards something like when you have a complexity, a more you had 3 levels of complexity, languages that were more elaborated. Do they have a tendency to be more symmetric in their inventories or not?
No, not at all.
Asymmetric, or there's no relation to symmetry at all?
I think we should forget this idea of symmetry, because it's something that it's nice to present things, but I'm not sure that it's the right way of looking at the things.
Okay, then thank you.
No problem.
I was thinking about physicists who used to play with symmetry too, and at some point they gave up and said, no, forget about that. Let's think about harmony or something like that. I think, Didier, thank you a lot. I know that you cannot stay longer because you probably have 40 minutes there in your lab. But I think we can now call the next talk. I don't know who is going to give this. Washington is not here. Maybe Ronaldo, who. The next talk is identification of transfer phenomena between Brazilian Portuguese and English as foreign language in simulated context using self-organizing maps. The authors are Washington Luiz Pinheiro Rodrigues Filho, João Mário de Santana Bezerra, Aratuza Rodrigues Silva Rocha, Wilson Júnior de Araújo Carvalho, Ronaldo Mangueira Lima Júnior, and Fábio Rocha Barbosa. So who is going to give the talk? Am I correct? None of them are.
I guess none of them are here.
Oh, so we have some talkers. We should have at least one. Well, in that case, Elisabeth and bunch Oliveira da Rosa is here.
Yes, I'm here.
Would you mind to give the next talk?
Oh, sure, no problem.
So Elisabeth, so please share your screen with us.
Okay. All right. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes, we can see. And so the audience is yours. You have 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more because the last talk didn't show up.
Okay.
So take your time and the audience is yours, please.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So my name is Elisabeth. I am currently a master's student at the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. My advisor is Dr. Rosane Silveira. And my project, my master's project at UFSC is focused on perception training, specifically using synthetic versus natural stimuli to help Brazilian learners of English identify the English vowels a and e. So that's what I have been working on. My study is based on Fledge's speech learning model, which says that L2 sounds that are perceived as being similar to an L1 category are typically more difficult to acquire. And to cope with this difficulty, learners tend to merge the L1 and L2 categories that are perceived as being similar and have difficulty distinguishing them as separate phonemes. So in the case of Brazilian, or comparing Brazilian Portuguese and English, looking at the phonetic inventories or vowel inventories, both languages have the vowel e, which is present in English words like bed. However, in English, we also have this vowel a, which is not present in Brazilian Portuguese. However, it's similar to it. So this would kind of fall into that category. So one study found that this vowel pair was the most poorly perceived pair in comparison to a few other minimal pairs that are typically difficult for Brazilian learners of English. And so that influenced my choice in focusing specifically on this vowel pair because it seems to be a difficult one. Another study also found that a was misidentified as e most of the time. And these results suggest that these learners do perceive as being similar to e and treat both phonemes as a single category in English, which is predicted by SLM. So just looking at a few studies that have used perception training specifically with synthetic stimuli. So Escudero notes that L2 learners of English tend to rely heavily on durational cues versus format frequency cues for distinguishing different vowel pairs. But this is not as easily generalizable to new contexts. So when you get a new voice or a new word, students may not as easily be able to identify those sounds. Oliveira noted that the subtle and crucial cues of the acoustic signal are enhanced, drawing learners' attention to them, and the less important features attenuated when using synthetic stimuli. And Chang et al. Also found that synthetic stimuli were useful in assisting learners to focus on the most important cues and essentially ignore the less important features. So that was my idea with the use of synthetic stimuli. And this study is helping basically helping the participants to focus on the format frequencies instead of durational cues. So the main objective for my study was to understand the effectiveness of natural and synthetic stimuli for perception training with the English vowels a and e for Brazilian learners of English. And I looked at the difference between natural and synthetic stimuli. And then I also looked at the generalizability of the learning of those types of stimuli and also the long-term effects. So for my study, I had 56 participants, which were then divided into 3 groups. So I had 22 participants that trained with natural stimuli, 15 that trained with synthetic stimuli, and 19 that were in a control group. The participants ranged in age from 19 to 49, and they were all native Brazilian Portuguese speakers and learners of English. And their proficiency level in English as a second language ranged from beginner to proficient. So for data collection, I started off with a background questionnaire, which participants completed via Google Forms. And then depending on which group they were assigned, we had between 3 and 6 online meetings on Zoom. So in the first meeting, participants completed a vocabulary test. The purpose of this was to kind of get an idea of their proficiency level, because participants were not all coming from the same classroom or language school. So to kind of get an idea of their proficiency level. And then in the same meeting, they also completed a perception pretest, which was administered on Gorilla, which is a platform that I'll talk about a little bit later. And then for 3 consecutive days, participants in the natural and synthetic groups completed perception training. And then on the 4th day, they had a perception post-test, and the control group returned for that. And then exactly 1 week later, all of the groups came back for a delayed perception post-test. So for the stimuli that I used for my for the perception training and for the tests, typically, studies in this area tend to use only native speakers for the audio recordings that participants are listening to or students are listening to. But considering that English is widely used as a lingua franca now, I wanted to consider that when I was selecting speakers for the voice recordings. Ideally, I would have loved to have speakers from all different parts of the world and different accents, but just with the time constraint, I selected 2 different populations that I thought would be the most applicable to my target audience or participants. So I started off with 13 speakers. I had 4 Native American English speakers and 8 Native Brazilian Portuguese speakers that were proficient users of English. They sent me audio recordings from their cell phone, and then I edited those using Pratt and Audacity just to cut the files, reduce background noise, and normalize amplitude. And then with the synthetic stimuli only, I manipulated the vowel duration to 350 milliseconds for all vowels. Previous research had used 500 milliseconds for the vowel duration, but I felt that 350 was still longer than the average vowel production to help students note those format frequencies, but it was a little bit not as long as 500 milliseconds and able to so that I was able to conserve audio quality. I then had 3 listeners, which were 1 Native American English speaker and 2 Native Brazilian Portuguese speakers, review the files. And based on their feedback, I then selected 4 sets of recordings from the American English speakers and 3 sets from the Brazilian Portuguese speakers. And then those 7 speakers' recordings were then tested with a pilot study. And in the pilot study, I had both American English speakers and Brazilian Portuguese speakers that also spoke English test these, and they had 100% accuracy with the Americans and 88.1% accuracy with the Brazilians. So these are the carrier words that I used for the stimuli. As you can see here, the S1, S2, these are different speakers. Each of them recorded a triad of words. So we had the 2 target vowels, A and E. And then based on previous research, I decided to also include a distractor vowel in each group. So for example, speaker 1 recorded bad, bed, and bead. The recordings from speakers 1 through 4 were used for the perception pretest and the perception training. And then all of the speakers' recordings were used in the post-test and delayed post-test. The idea with having these recordings from speakers 5, 6, and 7 that were new for the speakers was to test generalizability, so to see how well participants were able to identify these sounds that were from new voices and from with new words. So for the perception training, I used the platform Gorilla. Participants would see a screen like this. Is actually the same format that they used for the test and the training. So they would receive or view a screen like this, and it would have the triad on the bottom. Participants would need to click play to hear the audio file, and they could repeat it to hear it up to 2 times if necessary. And then they would just select which of the 3 words they wanted to hear, or which of the 3 words they believed they heard. Because I had a range of proficiency levels, I was concerned about word frequency affecting the results. And so I, on purpose to help with this, I always put the words with the same vowel in the same position. So the A vowel was always here and on the left side, the E vowel was always in the middle, and the distractor vowel E was always on the right side. So for perception training, students would, if they selected the correct answer, it would automatically move on to the next triad. If they got the answer incorrect, the wrong answer would disappear, and they would be left with the remaining two, and then they would have another chance to try. And if they got it wrong again, then they would be left with just the correct answer and then forced to listen to it again and select the correct answer. For the pretest and post-test, they didn't have any feedback, so they would select their answer and the screen would automatically move on to the next triad. So as I mentioned before, in the perception post-test, I had a mix of both the familiar stimuli and the unfamiliar stimuli. So they had 7 different triads to work with, and each of them were presented 2 times, each correct answer of the stimuli. So going into results from the study, I had 3 research questions that I want to discuss. So the first one is, what is the effect of natural versus synthetic stimuli for perception training with the vowel pair A and E? And then how successfully are participants able to generalize their perception training with these 2 types of stimuli to unfamiliar voices and carrier words? And then also, how successfully are participants able to maintain the effects of perception training with these 2 types of stimuli in the long term? So looking at research question number 1, just the difference between synthetic versus natural stimuli. I have here the results. As you can see, the control group actually did worse from the pretest to the post-test. And both of the experimental groups improved. So this is a gain score. The total score was out of 8. For each of these vowels. And as you can see, the natural group performed the best on in both cases, so with both of the vowels, but the synthetic group also improved. Results indicate that the perception training with both types of stimuli is effective. And as I mentioned, the control group actually performed worse. Participants in both of the natural and synthetic groups had higher gain scores for the A vowel than they did for the E vowel. And I think it's important to note that although the natural group performed better than the synthetic group, this is not very consistent with previous research. However, I think it's important to note that the group that trained with synthetic stimuli, they actually performed better on the pretest as well. And so they had less room for improvement. As I said, the maximum score for each vowel was 8. And as you can see here, the synthetic group scored 5.4 instead of 4.82 in comparison to the natural group in the beginning. And then also here, you can also see with the E vowel, they also outperformed them. And the total score, they also outperformed them in the pretest and also the post-test. Okay. So looking at research question number 2, looking at generalizability and how well participants were able to generalize their learning to unfamiliar voices and carrier words. So these scores are in percentage form because the number of stimuli was different from pretest to post-test. But as you can see, the control group performed much worse, and the natural and synthetic groups both improved. And again, the natural group performed the best, or had the best improvement score. So these results indicate that students are able to generalize their learning with both types of perception training. Participants who trained with the natural stimuli were the most successful at generalization. However, again, I think it's important to note the difference in the pretest score. Synthetic, for example, the synthetic group scored 68 versus 60 with the vowel A in the pretest, and they scored 61% in comparison to 59 with the natural group. So they had less room for improvement, which I think is important to consider in these results. So looking at research question number 3, the ability of participants to maintain their learning long term. So here on this graph, we have the blue bar represents the pretest score for control, natural, and synthetic. The green bar represents the post-test score, and the yellow bar is the delayed post-test. Again, these are all in percentage form because of the difference in number of stimuli. The control group performed worse on the post-test in comparison to the pretest, but in the delayed post-test, they actually scored higher than both of those scores, which is interesting to note. And the natural and synthetic groups performed similarly. So they both did better on the post-test than they did on the pre-test. And then in the delayed post-test, they performed still better than they did on the pre-test score, but they lost a little bit of their score in comparison to the post-test. So I think it's important to note that participants from both of the experimental groups did retain their learning long-term, although not 100%. The synthetic group was able to retain their learning slightly better than the natural group. And the control group improved greatly from the post-test to the delayed post-test. I think this is likely due to a couple of different factors, one being the practice effect. So although they didn't receive feedback and have the training, they were exposed to the stimuli in the post-test, and then in the delayed post-test, this was the second time that they were being exposed to that stimuli. So that may have been a factor in that. And then the other factor that I think is important to note is that this task of perception training was pretty tedious. So it wasn't very fun. And I think it probably got exhausting for participants to be doing the same task several days in a row. And because the control group didn't have that, they didn't have this part of exhaustion. And so maybe we're a little bit more motivated in the delayed post-test when they were completing that test. So just a summary of the main findings from this project. I found that perception training with both natural and synthetic stimuli does appear to be an effective way for Brazilian English learners to improve their identification of the English vowels a and e, which is consistent with previous research. Learners are able to generalize their learning to new voices and carrier words, and learners are able to retain their learning long-term. And synthetic stimuli may be more effective for retaining learning long-term. Some implications based on these results. It is possible for learners to establish new categories for sounds that are similar to but different from sounds in their L1. So this supports Fledge's SLM theory. And also I think it's important to note that this training was only with controlled tasks, and that alone seems to be able to trigger attention and lead to learning. So participants did not receive any form of explicit instruction. This was just a controlled task, and that seemed to be enough to be able to improve their perception of these sounds. Just several limitations of this study. Some of them I've mentioned already, but I think the training and testing condition in general, it was online, so my ability to observe participants is a little limited. It's like on a Zoom call. The fact that it was a repetitive task and just a little tedious, I think, causes exhaustion in the participants. I think they were less motivated by the end. And I think just the amount of time training. So participants only had 3 sessions that were about 10 minutes per session. And I think ideally I would have liked to have longer or not longer, more perception training sessions over a longer amount of time. Also, as I mentioned, the control group, I think, had the practice effect and also just less exhaustion with the training because they didn't have training. The time also, the delayed post-test was administered just 1 week after the post-test, and ideally this would have been several months later or something, but just because of the time limitations of a master's project, I decided to do it just 1 week later. Also the number of stimuli, so I just worked with 21 total carrier words, and 7 of those were distractors, so it was just 14 target vowels. And the participants themselves. So as I mentioned before, they came from different classroom environments. Ideally, I think it would have been nice if they were all from the same language school or the same classroom to have a little bit more control over their outside experiences with that. And here are my references. And that's all if there's any questions.
So thank you very much, Elisabeth. You can leave your screen shared with us, I think.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. I myself, I like very much the methodology that you did very carefully. Did you do it yourself with yourself or with your advisor?
Oh, my advisor helped me. Yeah, of course.
It's very clear. Well, one simple question before I open for more questions about the synthetic speech. How was it synthesized?
So the only part that I really altered was the duration of the vowel. So I controlled for that. So they were all had 350 milliseconds, which I used.
What did you use to synthesize speech?
I used Pratt and Audacity to alter them. So this part was done on Pratt.
Okay, good to know. So we have time for questions. Let me see the chat. That was before. Okay. So first of all, Vitor, you have a question. Vitor Medina.
Hello. Sorry about that. Hi, Elisabeth. Thank you for your presentation. This is a question on the teaching side. So it's more almost all curiosity. You said one of your main findings is that how this this controlled practice leads to learning on its own.
Yes.
And when as you profile your subjects according to proficiency, just because I couldn't see the very beginning of your presentation, did you check for any kind of inconsistencies in their production, or was just based on their proficiency? I'm asking that because this is a very difficult challenge for us to teach our students. And considering how beneficial this task was, if I was wondering whether having, checking the production of the students and crossing that against the perception would give us any insights into what's, still hindering their performance.
Right. I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but you're wanting to look at like the difference between proficiency and the effectiveness of the training? Is that what you mean? Okay, yeah, so I didn't look at production necessarily, the proficiency. I measured proficiency based on vocabulary. And what I didn't find very significant results on that. So that is something that I looked at. And I did looking at like correlations, and I didn't find a significant correlation. It seemed to be that kind of across the board it was effective. I was interested in this when I began my study at looking at, I was concerned thinking perhaps students with a very low proficiency that are beginner level students wouldn't benefit necessarily from the perception study, but that didn't seem to show up in my results, at least based on the vocabulary test. I think it would have been nicer to have more of a full proficiency test, because only basing it on vocabulary may not be necessarily the best way, but based on the results from that, I didn't find that it really was altered by proficiency level, which surprised me as a teacher as well.
So any more questions? Let's see, so I checking if I see the hand there. So there is somebody here. Adelaide, please.
Thank you for your talk. It was very nice indeed. But I was wondering, when you told us you synthesized vowels, you manipulated the duration, and the formants, as far as I could understand, were not, you didn't alter them. So my doubt is, if we have intrinsic duration for vowels, and you manipulate the duration so that all the vowels have the same duration, isn't that a bias for your study, for your experiment?
Yeah, so the intention of manipulating the duration and making that controlled across the board for all of the vowels, the idea was kind of to force participants to focus only on the formant frequency differences. So some previous studies actually kind of exaggerated the formant frequency differences. I chose not to. I wanted to see what it would look like if participants had the duration controlled, so they couldn't use that as a way to distinguish the vowels, but were forced to just hear the natural formant frequencies. So that was very intentional, I guess, on my part of controlling the duration to force students to listen, to be able to identify them by formant frequencies alone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank
you.
Are you bilingual?
I'm sorry?
Are you bilingual? You speak Portuguese and English in the same way?
No, English is my first language, so I speak Portuguese, but not perfectly. I'm working on it.
Just a question, because in order related to your study,
So your L1 is English.
Yes.
And for you, and E are very different.
Yes. But for example, in Portuguese, I don't know if I can say it, the O and O vowels sound the same to me.
Like your grandmother and your grandfather are the same.
Yes, this is very difficult. So I want to do perception training for myself with these vowels.
Adriano asked me something.
No, I was just going to say this is probably the most difficult thing for us, like, speakers of Portuguese. My kids, they're kind of bilingual. And sometimes I talk to them about this. And they're like, Daddy, they're totally different. And I was, no, you're kidding me. You're pulling my leg. No, Daddy, look, one is this way. The other is that way. Guys, you're saying the same thing. No, Daddy. And they think that I'm pulling their legs, So, you know what? I give up,
So any language has its, let's say when we try to go to L2, it's a frustration, like an O and O for you, and E and E for us, and for the Japanese, L and R, which is...
at some point you just kind of give up on it, so whatever.
Like, no, don't give up. Do perception training.
I pay attention. So that's why Elisabeth did the right thing, because I myself, I pay attention to the duration. Duration gives me a cue of how has been spoken.
Well, and I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would just say, even as an English teacher, I think in my experience teaching English here in Brazil, I think has been my tendency until starting this project and things is like to teach students to use duration. And so you say, oh, you have bed and bad, you have ship and sheep, it's longer. And so I think, I don't know how many other teachers are here, but I think as teachers, a lot of times that is a tendency because it seems to be helpful in some cases, but it doesn't tend to be generalizable. And so then students can have difficulty depending on the voice of the speaker or the word.
And in the beginning, you I think in your first slide, you wrote something like English as the lingua franca, which is a very good thing to put, because maybe for 100 years, maybe less than 100 years, that English is the lingua franca in the world, right? Mm-hmm. It's quite new. It's not a lot long time. I think maybe after the Second World War.
After the war, the CIA. Sure the CIA used to be like concerned about spreading English, to turn it like, that's true. And after the war and with the beginning of the, the electronics, how to say, explosion. So they don't have to do that anymore.
So we for questions now, we only accept questions from people whose name start with U. Is there any questions from Ubiratan, for example?
All right. So thank you very much. Well, your presentation was really, really nice. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I don't know if you're familiar with the articles by Larry Holt, the Q-weighting hypothesis. I can pass you some text later on. This has been implemented in the latest version of the speech learning model. The Flagey and Bone 2021, but I think that this background could help you out even more, because then you can establish your hypothesis. Well, Brazilians are going to focus on duration, and they have to weight this cue differently in order to start assuming F1 and F2 cues as the primary cue. So I can pass you the references through the chat, and then if you have trouble finding it, I can send it to you, okay?
Yes, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
No, thank you.
So, Elisabeth, thank you a lot for your talk, and luck at the end of your master's. When do you defend your dissertation?
I'm sorry? When do I what?
Your master's.
When am I going to defend?
Yes.
Hopefully December. I have been, it's been getting delayed a lot with COVID and everything. I had some delays with data collection, but I'm hoping December.
Good luck.
Thank you.
So the next talk is from Felipe Kupske. Are you there, Felipe? Yes, Felipe is here. Felipe, can you share your screen with us?
Sure, just a second.
Seems to be a very interesting talk, and I'm going to attend it. Always thinking about the first talk given by the long talk at the plenary session from Eleonora Albano, because I didn't read. I read your abstract, but I didn't. I don't know what exactly is in it. But it seems to be as the other side of the coin of Eleonora's talk. So
no, actually, she talked about draft. That other conception will be almost the very same thing. But thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon for those who are in Brazil, right? Good evening for the others. For me, it's an immense pleasure. I'm very happy and very humbled to be able to present this piece of a project to such qualified audience. Okay. The title of this talk is the social-semiotic landscapes of immigration, attrited L1 VOT production as evidence of phonological adaptability. I need to acknowledge, of course, funding agencies. I also need to acknowledge Genophone, Labico, Nopfali, LaFala, because those are the places where I usually present my insane ideas before bringing them to public. So from Unicampi, URGS, UFSC, and UFBA. So I decided to divide this talk into three parts. Hopefully you're going to understand the first title. The part one is the macrame armor. The second part is the project idea. And finally, I'm going to talk about the social semiotic landscapes of immigration. So part one, the macrame armor. So it seems, at least to me, and probably some of you are going to agree, that the paradigm of simplicity is still quite dominant in linguistics. If we follow, for example, the tenets proposed by Horn, we're going to see that those characteristics are still very present currently, such as simplicity, not working well, adheres to the principles of universality, it seeks to reduce totalities into simple constituents, it looks for principles, rules to bring in order to a system, assumes determinism and linear causality, separates the subject from the object, and finally treats contradictions as errors or inadequacies. One of the consequences of this simplicity is that in a way it ends up in enveloping grammar in a kind of armor. It protects grammar from, for example, the outside or the surface level. So for two reasons, grammar, for example, phonology would be only indirectly connected to the environment and to phonetics. We still fight about, separating or not phonetics and phonology, for instance. And the second reason is that under this perspective, grammar would be stable and unshakable, at least, of course, within a generation. However, and the point is that studies on bilingualism have at least penetrated this kind of armor, right? So if we assume that grammar is an armor, and I think we all have in mind that we have a grammar in a way that holds language together, this grammar would be a macrame armor. Why? Because it's made of wide open knots, permeable, adaptive, self-organizing, and sensitive to the environment, of course. We usually, when we're talking about second language development, this is the image that comes to our mind. So we have a dominant first language that is going to transfer, is going to influence the L1, the L2, sorry, and hopefully this influence is going to be reduced over time. It's not wrong, we actually face that. So this is why we have accent, this is why I have a strong Brazilian accent while using English, but this is not the only, reality, right? So currently we know that both languages interact in various levels and regardless the level of proficiency of the bilingual, right? And we also know that as the L2 becomes more dominant in the daily context of use, sorry, my voice, the influence might take a different direction. That is, the L2 might influence the L1. So I'm still with a raspy voice. So we can reach scenarios like this in which the L2 is more dominant than the L1, and then the transference is going to be the other way around, right? So Kupske says, with an L2, an individual's L1 will at some point be irrevocably changed. And this is what I would call first language attrition. Of course, language attrition goes beyond first language attrition, but while I'm here, if I refer to language attrition, I'm referring to first language attrition. I usually, I remember Bida saying that he uses language attrition as the very same thing as a draft. Well, I use language attrition is a synonym of drift if we're talking about gestural drift, such as Eleonora Albano, as she draws from Eicefala. But there's another current also trading, dealing with the phenomenon called phonetic attrition, phonetic drift, that in my opinion, they will be slightly different. So even though the term probably is a little bit weird or unknown to many of you, it was coined in 1938 by Aiden Haugen in this very interesting essay, Language and Immigration. And he was the first one revealing that Norwegian immigrants, they were performing their L1 in different ways compared to their compatriots. So it's a growing area. So I suggest this reading. So the Oxford Handbook of Language Attrition and a little bit of merchandising here. We're going to launch this book soon called Investigando o Som das Línguas Não Nativas. Ubiratan, Ronaldo, and myself organized it. And we have a chapter fully devoted on language attrition. Okay, so finally, the project idea. Well, back in 2016, we wanted to investigate Brazilian Portuguese L1 VOT production by Brazilian immigrants in London. And we were investigating LOR, length of residence. So we had to control an insane amount of variables. So out of almost 100 participants, we ended up with 12, okay? And integration, and we're going to talk about integration soon, was controlled as well. So the hypothesis here was that the short lag VOT for Brazilian Portuguese would drift towards the English long pattern. And that's what the results showed. So we found attrited VOT data for Brazilians with length of residence higher, superior to 4 years. So this is the graph for PA, for TA, and for KA. This is now the baseline expected for Brazilian Portuguese. English data here is shown just for comparison. And as we can see, as time increases, as length of residence increases, VOT also increases. And this Brazilian Portuguese VOT is drifting towards the L2 pattern. That is, Brazilian Portuguese speakers, native speakers of Brazilian Portuguese are using in a way the L2, the environment pattern to produce L1 words. But the point here is that exposure to the L1 and the L2 and frequency of the L1 and L2 are not the only variables. And we're currently investigating the role of attitudes, motivations, and emotions in L2 development and L1 attrition. So I've played around with my data some years ago. It was presented GT de Phonologia. And I said played around because I took part of the data I had collected to my PhD. But instead of controlling integration, I decided to divide the group into highly integrated Brazilians, those that were actually very integrated to the L2 and the L2 community. On the other hand, I decided to take the second group, Brazilian immigrants that were not integrated, that they didn't want to be in London. They were just there for, because they were following their husbands, for example. And as we can see, that was very interesting, even though full of methodological issues. Here again, the graph for PA, for TA, and for KA. In the middle, we have data from English shown for comparison as well. And the first group in red, we have immigrants, Brazilian immigrants that are integrated to the L2. So again, as we can see, as time increases, the VOT value increases as well, and they're drifting towards the L2 standard, right? The same doesn't apply for Brazilian Portuguese immigrants with the very same lengths of residence. They were not integrated to the L2 or to the L2 community. So after the presentation, I decided to create a project which, thank God, is now funded. And it's called the Social-Semiotic Landscapes of Immigration and Phonological Adaptability. So the idea here is, well, it's not a 4-year project, but I have funding for 4 years. But the idea is to track and follow the participants as long as I can. The idea of the project is to create a database, a corpus of Brazilian Portuguese, L1 by immigrants in the UK and the USA. And now I'm considering not only production, but also speech perception and other psycholinguistics analysis, such as lexical fluency. Unfortunately, well, the main idea was to be a longitudinal data collection, a longitudinal study that is to track and follow those participants as soon as I can, as far as I can. But it's paused due to COVID, so we only had one data collection. I think it's going to be resuming January 2022. Hopefully, I'm going to London so that because now we are back to the drawing board, because many of our participants, they had short length of residences in the UK. Now they moved back to Brazil. They are in different countries. So I still don't know how we're going to continue this project, right? And the focus here was individual differences, social semiotical landscapes, that is how integrated they are, the reception of the new the L2 population, social networks, face-to-face social networks. What I'm presenting today is a subset, okay? I'm going to present data on Brazilian Portuguese VOT so that I can compare to my previous studies. But the focus here, I'm presenting data from 18 proficient Brazilian women plus 10 controls, okay? Yet again, I have graphs for PA, for TA, and for KA. Data from English controls shown just for comparison here. Brazilian Portuguese native speakers for PA, for TA, and for KA. And as you can see in the middle, we have immigrants, okay? We only have statistically significant differences to TA, but we don't have for PA and TA, they are statistically different, and for TA, they are not. But the interesting part here is then we separate the groups between those who are integrated and not integrated. Every group has 3 participants with floor between 0 and 4, 3 participants with floor between 4 and 7 years of residence, and between 8 and 12, okay? As you can see, I think the jump line here says a lot. So those that are integrated, you can see this tendency of, the Brazilian Portuguese VOT drifting towards the L2. We can see also that the variability of the data is, the volume plots are quite interesting here. It's smaller in those who are non-integrated compared to those who are integrated. Here we have the same pattern for TA, the same pattern for KA. And then I decided to separate them into 2 groups, so those who are not integrated and those who are integrated. Again, Brazilian controls and SSP controls just for comparison. And now we have statistically significant differences for all the sounds, PA and KA. But the post hoc says we only have significant differences when controls are compared to integrated participants and when integrated participants are compared to non-integrated participants, right? So when you compare controls to non-integrated participants, we have no statistically significant difference. So part 3, so the social-semiotic landscapes of immigration. Well, this kind of data shows, of course, I know it's full of limitations. It's very premature. This data collection is meant to be my baseline, right? But it shows in a way the L1 grammar adapts or might adapt. Points out that length of residence is not a clear index of L2 use during immigration and probably not a reliable variable. We must consider, for example, full-time equivalents, such as is proposed by Flegg and Bond 2021. We should multiply length of residence for L2 frequency, but I would suggest using LOR and integration. Of course, integration is not an easy variable to measure, but we can use that as well. The idea is that integrated immigrants have bigger social networks with the host country and are more willing to use the host language. So this might lead to the convergence of patterns and to the adjustment of speech. And according to Albano, some patterns of production are more stable, others more variable, and their probability of occurrence correlates with social affiliation. This is pretty much what we can see. So those who are affiliated, they remain to the same Brazilian Portuguese pattern found for compatriots, while those who have who are more affiliated to the L2 tend to drift towards the L2 while using Brazilian Portuguese. I also bring 2 quotations from Albano. Well, Albano says, we must abandon the rigid conception of the signifier and embrace that phonological grammar is only...
Albano in this meeting is Eleonora.
Yes. We must abandon the rigid conception of the signifier and embrace that the phonological grammar is only relatively stable, and that its drift brings out several variants that produce meaning. So grammar is construed from the outside. And finally, speech production is conditioned to external feedback, which guides its selection, deselection, and implementation, and of course, correlates to integration. So finally, I'm sorry that I'm going too fast. I'm a little bit nervous for the first time in my life. So this kind of data helps going against conservative hegemonic ways of thinking in linguistics, as grammars adapt to the context and to the learning of additional languages. So first languages are not rigid, they are dynamic systems. It establishes that grammar are affected and driven by experience, and many of us would agree with that. Albano, Alves, Baia, Christopher Silva, Demolin, Junior, Silva, and many others that I probably forgot. And finally, it demands, this kind of data demands that we invest on the ecology of language development and attrition. So in my opinion, we don't need just alternative types of data analysis, we need alternative thinking. So we must embed our data in the social-semiotic landscapes. Some references. Sorry that I went too fast, and thank you.
So, Felipe, thank you a lot. I didn't know you were a nervous, but otherwise I would not have interrupted you. But it's good to have Albano with us because she's really nice. So good to know it. So we have time for questions. Ronaldo said, very interesting, Felipe. I have a question. So Ronaldo, please go ahead.
Hi, Felipe. Thanks for the talk. The topic is very interesting. I have a practical question that is not really related to your data and the results you presented, but we've started collecting some longitudinal data of English L2 by Brazilians here in Brazil. And the thing we usually do is we collect one-time data of those students speaking Portuguese, usually in the first semester. And then for many semesters, we keep collecting data on their English L2 because we want to see English L2 development. Based on language attrition and the fact that their L1 can have attrition, even learning the language in Brazil, would you say that we should collect data of their Portuguese every semester as well? So when we want to look at their English in the 8th semester, for instance, we should compare that with the 8th data collection of Brazilian Portuguese or not? What would you say or recommend in practical terms for longitudinal data collection?
I think that's, well, thank you very much. It's a great question. I think that's the ideal scenario, right? Schmidt, Kupske, they're going to say, if we only analyze the L1 or if you only analyze the L2, we are ignoring a huge part of the process, right? And I've been working with the impact of explicit instruction on language attrition. And my participants find, well, they yelled attrited data after one session of explicit instruction. So in the ideal world, yes, we would collect both L1 and the L2. But I know it's the same job, right?
Okay, thanks.
So, Eleonora, so you are Albano, right? So please.
Well, first of all,
of course, you know her. It's the first time you talk to her, no?
Well, I'm kind of moved by the mention and also by the translations, beautiful translations of my Portuguese. You know, the book was written in Portuguese. And thank you for the challenges. You know, I appreciate this kind of open-ended project. You don't know where you get it, because language is complex, as Didier has just said. And I have just a very trivial methodological issue. It seems like your carrier sentences ends in the target word. Is that the case? Then why don't you consider adding something else afterwards? Because many final prosodic phenomena that might interfere, not really with VOT, but with voice quality, which might, in the end, affect VOT, affect the whole utterance. So perhaps leave these things for another word that has nothing to do with what you want to test. I think it's a very simple thing, but I've observed many talks in which people did not follow this simple rule for carrier sentences, but I didn't feel like talking to everyone. But in your case, I make a point because I was very pleased with your presentation, and I hope you're very successful. As to when we can continue, let's try to imagine other scenarios, not face-to-face scenarios, because there's so many things to consider in this pandemic, and research has got to go. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. But the good news is I have 2 carrier sentences now. I use the same carrier sentences I used during my PhD so that I can compare data, but I also have, eu diria baixinho, so that I look for different data as well. Because now I'm not only analyzing VOT, as I'm trying to create this corpus, I have more than 1 carrier sentences, and in the future, hopefully we'll have the time to analyze different aspects as well. So I have 2.
Okay, baixinho. Many people don't know the story because that's kind of fashionable. It's only really useful when you when you're looking at vowels, because B is being a label. It doesn't have you move the rest of your vocal tract so much. But it's just because, but maybe you don't need a trisyllable. Maybe you can use also a disyllable, because the only, in this case, I think the only function of this further word would be not to let your voice quality change beforehand. So, but baixinho is fine, because we don't even say baixinho. We say baixinho. Sometimes just devoicing the final syllable. So I think you can leave it there. But it was a beautiful surprise. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It means a lot to me to hear that from you.
Felipe, are there any more questions? Rafael has a question.
Sure. So thank you for the talk. It's great.
Ronaldo, just after Rafael, is okay?
I think it touched me, this talk, because I think I'm a huge, very big victim of language attrition. Living here in France and then have lived in Germany too. My wife is Austrian, and then when I talk to my mother, he says, "What language are you talking?" And anyway, a question that I have here is, maybe I missed something. Did you measure the VOT in the L2 in your subjects too? I perhaps missed this.
Yeah, I do have L1.
Did you show it or not?
No, I didn't. Sorry, just the L1.
Okay, so I thought I missed that. But does it correlate? So what you see? So people that increase the VOT in L1, do they increase too in L2?
Yes, for those who are integrated, yes. For those who are not integrated, they still have strong accent in the L2. But as far as we are concerned, after 7 years of immigration, it drifts towards the L2 as well. But we can see this, stronger correlation just for the ones who are actually integrated to the L2.
Okay, it does correlate. That's my question. If it was not correlated, so you could have 2 classes of people, say that the bear in English and keep the things correctly in L1, yeah, and that may mean something to it. But as you say that it correlates, so it means that it's a real phenomenon. Okay, thank you.
So, Felipe, a simple question, very simple, about the pandemic. It imposed a pause in your experiments. Was it useful or a problem?
Well, useful in a way because now we are trying to foresee the future, and because we're now back to the drawing board, so we are actually trying to come up with new ideas to collect data. But the problem is actually speech perception. We still don't know how to collect speech perception in a proper way, and that's just my stupidity. But so it's a good point. We are trying to be prepared for the future pandemics. But the bad point, and it's a terrible point in my opinion, is that many of my participants are now back to Brazil, or they moved to different countries due to the pandemics. So basically the first group I had, so if immigrants from 0 to 4 years of immigration, they are in different countries, they moved to the USA or they are back to Brazil. So that is a problem because actually that was my focus group because I wanted to follow them for 10 years at least. And now we need to find a new group.
In that case, I don't know if it's possible, but I think it is. You should consider the possibility of collecting data remotely.
Yes, yeah.
So it's possible to record. It's not. Maria is working on that. Maria Cantoni is working in that direction.
Okay, I'm very open to suggestions, so please help me.
Okay, so any more questions before we move to the next talk? So thank you a lot, Felipe. And I invite now Laura Cherechevsky or Ubiratan Alves. I don't know who is going to talk. Ubiratan or Laura?
Hi.
Hi. Hello, Laura. Can you share your screen?
Absolutely. Just a second.
Okay. So the next talk from Ubiratan and Laura, a change point analysis in language development, a study of voice onset time production in a multilingual system. So Laura, you have 15 minutes, but as today, in contrast with the other days, we have time to discuss, and I hope we have a good discussion after your talk. So the audience is yours.
All right, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Cherechevsky. I finished my master's studies with Professor Ubiratan Alves earlier this year at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. And today I'm presenting a segment of my thesis. This study is called Change Point Analysis in Language Development, a study of voice onset time production in a multilingual system. We chose this particular research object, this theme, that is the development of voice onset time in multilingual systems due to its increased relevance in supporting a dynamic view of language. It also encompasses matters of adaptability and self-organization, as this theory is essentially a theory about change. Some aspects that we tried to observe were language development as an ongoing process in time, the interconnectivity of typologically different subsystems, variability in learning as part of that process, and the emergence of new attractor states and phase shifts. Much like Professor Bita's talk yesterday, the main goals of this presentation are to provide empirical evidence to the interconnectedness of languages in multilingual systems, to discuss the importance of longitudinal process-oriented approaches to language development, and to present different methods of analyzing longitudinal data. We believe that this study can contribute both theoretically and empirically to a better understanding of multilingual development from a view of language as a complex dynamic system. So in this study, we are grounded on a view of language through the complex dynamic systems theory, the CDST. And according to the theory, language develops as a complex dynamic system that encompasses multiple agents in constant interaction, such as the speakers in a community, or one of the many areas of language, or the many languages of knowledge in a multilingual speaker. And to the theory, language is also adaptive based on its own trajectory. For instance, a speaker's behavior is based on their past interactions. Language has multiple levels of manifestation and complexity, which vary from neuronal activity in an individual brain to speech and discourse in a community. And language develops itself with its own self-organizing abilities through interrelated patterns of experience, social interaction, and cognitive processes and mechanisms. Within linguistic development, when we look at the multilingual scope, we need to think about the interconnectedness of the system components and the phenomenon of language attrition, language transfer, or language drift. I will not choose one term over the other today, but for instance, some models of sound perception and production, such as Flagis, propose a common phonetic phonological space in which the acoustic categories of all languages are organized in the same space. That is, there is no way of separating the sounds of an L1 from those of an L2. And from this, we can use Kupske's concept of language attrition, which proposes that attrition symbolizes the force resulting from the contact of two bodies, in this case, it's two languages, that are in constant movement. And this concept reclaims the term of attrition and remodels its traditional concept of total or partial loss of L1 characteristics and takes up the CDST premise that change is inherent to development. So if the system is in constant movement, we may find it in continuous change in a given state, and we'll see variability. But sometimes the system may go through a significant change that exceeds its current state. And if this particular change leads to the reorganization of the system as a whole, as in the emergence of a new attractor state, we call it a phase transition or a phase shift. As Professor Bira explained yesterday, this study is part of a larger project, and this specific segment of the study has its own specific goal, which was to inferentially verify possible phase shifts of VOT patterns in each of the language subsystems, especially after the beginning of the explicit instruction through change point analysis provided by the change point analyzer software. And we have a research question, which is, do change point analysis evidence phase shifts in the development of VOT patterns, especially after the start of explicit L2 instruction? And how do these possible results provide evidence for a dynamic discussion about the self-structuring of the linguistic system? So in the study, we're working with voice onset time, very straightforward, but I should comment that among the languages in this study, Portuguese and French have a different pattern of VOT in the production of stop consonants compared to English, especially for voiceless stops, and it's based on this difference that we start this study. And to achieve that, we propose a methodology following the premises of the view of language as a CDS. So changes and interactions between subsystems of multilingual speakers could be investigated through accelerating the development of the L2, in this case, represented by the VOT. So we worked with a longitudinal design in the ABA format with 12 data collection points, which were intersected right in the middle with an intervention of 6 sessions with explicit instruction of phonetic phonological aspects of English, which was the participants' L2. And this intervention took place between weeks referring to data collection points 4 and 9. In this study, we try to replicate different process analysis to encompass and address variability. But at the same time, we tried to find some patterns regarding language development. So we had 5 participants from the most different backgrounds with different proficiency levels in their additional languages and the most different routines, especially now during the pandemic. And well, I'm going to present the results from one particular participant who was a 24-year-old at the time, a graduate student who worked as a French teacher. She took a self-evaluation test and graded herself a 6 in English and a 10 in French. So it's quite interesting to note that her L3 was more active than her L2 because she worked as a French teacher, even though she started studying English before she even started learning French. So the participants were presented 3 different reading tasks. Each week they received 23 carrier sentences, repeated 3 times each with 18 target words with pataka in word initial position and 5 distracted words. So the Brazilian Portuguese and English instruments were the same as in Kupske, for we wanted to be consistent with what we've been doing, and also because we wanted to be able to compare results. with the monolingual native speakers of English as well. We also use the same methodological control as Kupske in the French instrument. And even though they receive the same target words each week, we randomized the order of the carrier sentences and changed the distractor words every time. Again, this study was conducted during the pandemic, but we asked the participants not to complete each task back to back, but rather take some time between them, and if possible, even on different days. So for the acoustic analysis, we used PRAT, and to measure VOT, we used a similar criteria to previous works. Again, measuring VOT is very straightforward, so there was not much to innovate here. And for the statistical analysis, we plotted the participants' developmental trajectories, considering minimum, maximum, and mean values from each data collection session. And we conducted change point analysis, which is an inferential method that uses resampling and cumulative sums to identify a pattern shift or the point of change in a set of longitudinal data. We use the change point analyzer software, which is traditionally used in other areas like economy, finance, and biology. And I believe it's fairly new to language and speech sciences. A change point analysis is able to actually detect several changes. For each change in pattern, it provides practical information, including the confidence level, which indicates a probability that a change has actually occurred, and the confidence interval, which indicates when that change has occurred. Now I'm going to show you some of the tabs with the outputs from the software. In this first graph, we have the change point analysis visual plot. The bold black line in the graph represents the raw data of the mean VOT values of P in the L1 for participant 5 over the 12 collection points. The dark blue lines represent the range of amplitude of the control limits. That is the maximum range of variation in which the values can fluctuate, assuming that no change has occurred. And if the black line exceeds the control limits, we would have the first indication that a change has taken place, which may simply be an outlier or an indication of an actual phase shift. However, the light blue background represents the area that should contain all values varying within the control limits. And the displacement of this area in light blue in the background actually indicates a phase shift, as the average values within the first segment show a sudden change, starting to vary in a different range, represented by the second segment of the area in light blue. Now, this table here indicates the estimated point of change to another phase, in this case, in data collection point number 5. With a confidence level of 97% indicated by the confidence interval, which in this case points exactly to session 5. And next on the table indicates the values before and after the change, that is the average values of variation in the first phase, considering the average of all inputs within this first phase, which go from 34.25 milliseconds to 46.29 milliseconds in the second phase. And finally, the level of change indicates its importance. In this particular example, the level 1 change indicates that this was the first significant change identified by the software in the first analysis run of the data. And other levels of change may appear depending on how many phase changes are identified and whether these are significant. Finally, this third graph represents the cumulative sum analysis, which actually does not mean the cumulative sum of the values of each entry, and is in fact, according to Taylor, they are cumulative sums of differences between the values and the average. And these differences sum to 0, so the cumulative sum always ends at 0. So in the Q-zone graph from this data, a downward sloping line can be seen, indicating that the values in that period have a tendency to be below the general average until there is a change in the direction of the line, starting to have an upward slope, indicating that the values from that portion of the graph tend to be above the overall mean. So we also look at the shaded background of the chart, which indicates if and where there has been a significant change in the slope of the line, referring to the table with confidence intervals. And another important information that the Q-zone chart brings is that the straighter the line, regardless of the direction, up or down, the greater the certainty that no change occurred in that period. On the other hand, the more curved the line is, as is the case between points 4 and 9 in this graph, for instance, the greater the possibility that other changes from other levels have taken place. As for results, I first bring this participants' Portuguese L1 data, and we can contrast here on the left the values of the Portuguese L1 as pointed out by our theoretical framework, and the mean VOT values for each consonant produced by the participant in the first data collection session. It's not hard to see that this participant already shows signs of L1 attrition with higher mean values than those of the reference in the 3 consonants, especially for P and T. And what it's interesting is that this participant's T is actually shorter than the P. And when we look at the VOT developmental curves over the 12 weeks, we see some variability, especially in the maximum instances of each consonant in darker shades of the graph. And the averages, which are represented by the midtones, remain more or less in the same range, but there is some variation as well. When we look at this participant's English productions, we can see that she already starts the study with mean VOT values very close to those of the reference, which justifies the high values in the L1. But when we look at her developmental curves, we can see that the 3 consonants jump right after the beginning of the intervention in session 4. And they seem to move more or less stable. And at the end of the intervention, they slightly decrease in duration. And when we look at the French data, the participant starts the study with VOT productions in French much longer than the reference values, especially for K. Which I would like to point out is already semi-aspirated here in southern Brazil. So most likely there is an influence from the L2, but also from the L1 itself in her L3. And when we look at the developmental curves, the max values show some crazy behavior. And when we look at the means in the midtones, you can clearly see that they start to change at the beginning of the intervention. Now, when we get to the actual change point analysis, we'll see that there are actually phase shifts in the VOT production in the L1, even in a short period of time. And if you remember Professor Bira's talk yesterday, those downward peaks, the significant falls in the production of T, they also show up here as phase shifts for this same participant. So I'll propose a discussion right away. So is the production in the L1 deflecting from the other languages, or is it returning from an increase in VOT values during the intervention? And when we look at the English data, we can make a comparison. We found phase shifts with changes in the VOT data for the 3 consonants. But looking at the graph of the same measure as the previous graph with the mean values of T, but this time in English, her L2, it shows 2 phase shifts over the 12 sessions, one with an increase in VOT and the other with a decrease. But you can see that the final phase still has longer VOT durations than the initial phase. And finally, when we look at the French data, even though we only found significant phase shifts with an increase in VOT, the change points graph of French averages in T is very similar to the English graph, even though that the other change at the end with the decrease in VOT in English has not been identified here. So when we compare the three subsystems in the two types of inferential analysis, the peaks from yesterday and today's change points, we see that the deviant data are not that contradictory, especially when we take other participants into account. This is just for show, but all of them present curious or apparently deviant data that could be discussed as the simulation or the return from a short-term assimilation of a longer VOT pattern. Well, this is to show that changes, after all, are inherent to development, whether they are L1 attrition, transfer to the L3, or the destabilization of the L2. So in short, languages are entangled and interconnected in a multilingual system, and they influence one another. Longitudinal studies can provide very interesting data when it comes to language development as a process. And well, technology is here to help us. So exploring new methods of data analysis may aid us in understanding this complex dynamic system that is language a little better. These are my references, and thank you.
So, thank you a lot, Laura. One small comment. Why people put the references at the end for 1 second?
Oh, you want me to go back?
No, don't worry, because it's impossible to pay attention. But anyway, the meeting is being recorded, so anybody later, those who want to see the reference, they only have to go there and see it. So, but in a real meeting, it doesn't make sense. We have Ronaldo with a couple of questions. So, Ronaldo, please.
Hi, Laura. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very clear and very interesting results. I have two questions, actually. The first one is the software that you use, the analyzer, it uses the means, right, to calculate and give you the output. But do you feed the software the means already, or do you feed the raw data and it uses means to calculate?
It actually, we feed the means, and we fed it the means and the max values and the minimum values, but it uses means of the means and means of the max values, means of the minimum values, and standard deviation as well.
Okay, right. You see, because when you showed,
it's always means,
okay.
It's never raw data.
Okay, because you see, when you showed the result with the data and showing the maximums and how the maximums varied more than the means and then the minimums, this makes sense, you know, because first I want to congratulate for you guys to try to use different statistical analysis, because when we use those null hypothesis significance tests, they all need normal data and regular variability. They need the data to be homoscedastic, right? But in L2 development, we actually don't want regular or equal variability, because if our learners have a skewed distribution to the left, it means that they are trying to do something different, right? So, I mean, if they have a mean VOT, but you see that the maximum VOT is varying a lot, it means that they are attempting, they are trying for something higher, right? And then taking that into account is necessary, right? So more than the means, I think that if we're coming from the premise that variability matters, the model that we use needs to use variability to give us some results, and not only means, right? It needs to use, I don't know, standard deviations, standard errors, or look at the whole thing that is happening, because this skew towards higher VOT values is very important. It means students are trying something, but those low values get in the way every now and then, right? So this is the first comment. I see you guys are trying several methods, and I think this is very informative for the field. And well, I think we need from here to the future to keep trying new things, right? The other question would be how would it be possible to conduct parallel to an individual analysis, a group analysis? Because you see, since we're coming from the premise that variability is important, we need to look at individual data. This is for sure. But decisions in terms of materials writing and workshops for teachers and things we do at university to have new English teachers in the market, we need some decisions that are also based on group tendencies, right? And I don't, it seems very challenging to use this particular method to look at both individual trajectories of development and also group tendencies. Is it really a challenge? Were you guys able to also look at group tendencies with this particular analysis?
So this is part of my master thesis, right? And I wanted to do group analysis as well, but when the pandemic hit, I had to cut it off because, well, I couldn't, follow a whole group of students.
Yeah, but you would be doing that in a product-oriented analysis with traditional methods, in a way. I mean, with traditional statistics. I think, I think the way to do it is to try and pursue something that Laura tried to do in her dissertation. She had 5 participants, okay? Change point analysis will not allow you to get all of them together, okay? But once again, you are getting each one of them individually. And when Laura shows that chart, I don't know if you can go back, Laura, but we tend to find tendencies, and she discusses that in her dissertation, all right? So, I mean, it's more like something that Van der Loo is going to say that, okay, we get to general tendencies by analyzing many participants, all right? If you consider a process-oriented approach only. Of course, we could have run a product-oriented approach as well, okay, which Laura was going to carry out, but I don't think this is the aim of your question. I think the aim of the question is how to generalize based on a process-oriented approach, right? Considering this method, okay, we have to consider many participants. And once again, the analysis is done one by one, and then we have to unite. There isn't a formal mechanism, okay, and the method itself that would allow us to reach an assumption, okay, just sheer observation.
All right, thank you.
Any more questions? Laura, one thing, while we were presenting, my opinion,
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Sorry, is it what? Eleonora has a question before me, so I will be the last one. Eleonora, please, your question. Is my sound too low?
No, it's okay.
Okay, sorry, I was maybe some contact problem. Eleonora, please raise your you can raise your question.
Well, it's not really a question, it's just a comment. These data that you guys have been describing since Peter's presentation yesterday make me think a lot about Aníbal Quijano. I haven't had the time to process this, no? I'm just going to ask if you were challenged by his ideas. Of course, and there was only one slide in my presentation, but if you are interested, then I can send you the references, because Felipe showed something by our dear Boaventura. I think Boaventura is unanimous. And Quijano is not very well known. He's dead now. He died a couple of years ago in the United States. He fled Peru a long time ago in the Fujimori. Yeah. era, but his analysis is located in Latin America. I just want to hear a bit if that concerns you, that instigates you. Just a word.
I would love to read it. I'm not familiar with it, but I would love to read it.
Okay.
Well, let me. We have been studying complex individuals as complex dynamic systems, right? And as complex dynamic systems, okay, the environment they're in, the political pressure they suffer, and whatever condition that's part of their individual should make a difference, okay? And in the sense, I think your work, Eleonora, and also Felipe's work is more advanced than ours, because you have already started, implemented that in your discussions, right? I think we have to do that, okay? And I think Laura should, because she has a long history of political activism at university. She was part of the student council, so on and so forth. But in her master's degree, we focused on the language itself. But if we consider the epistemology of the thing, okay, we know that this is the result of a multitude of factors, okay? And many of these factors have been raised on Monday by you and have just been raised by Felipe. So maybe, right, if Laura keeps on studying her doctorate, I have been trying to convince her, but she's been reluctant, resistant to that, okay, she can have a more social perspective to that in order to explain our data. And in her dissertation, she talks a lot about the participants. She has this, you know, complete view of the participants, but I mean, we have to get to know them better. We have to know what's going on. And there is a part in her dissertation that she discusses that, but not theoretically yet. So we have to pursue that. So thank you very much. And thank you for teasing us with that, because that's something that we have to pursue.
Okay, thank you for your interest. I'll send you the references, okay?
Thank you, Eleonora.
So thank you very much. We should move to the next talk, but I don't know if I missed it or not. During the talk, Laura or Biratan, wait, let me finish the point here. Have you ever thought what would be the underlying processes, the processes that underlying phase shift or phase transitions? Because the data are really interesting. And while I was watching the presentation, I was trying to understand what would be the underlying process to that phenomenon. Why does it happen? Why is it a transition? Why isn't it something that moves smoothly?
Would you like to say something? Should I, Laura? You know?
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, we have to consider that these participants have received instruction. So in a way, we have been, you know, changing the system in a way, right? So by doing that, we expect to, at a first moment, have, you know, what I showed yesterday, the peak, which captures the moment the system gets unstable, right? So they had a very stable system, they have instruction, their system gets unstable, and then it moves towards another attractor state, right? Which in this case is calculated by change point analysis, which may be either a rise or a decrease in the VOT values, but in terms of overall behavior, right? So it's just like they have this more stable in terms of overall behavior. They have something that shakes that, so they move in a very unexpected direction, and then they try to follow or pursue another direction in an overall sense, right? I don't know if I have answered your question. If
no,
that was
it gives me a good cue of what would be happening, and that your strategy is quite interesting. Okay, so let me see the chat here. The way you do linguistics, Bira and Laura, is political. Where is it? It's political already. Well, taking complexity beyond metaphorical level. I agree with Felipe. There is a lot of conceptual confusion in current discussions of complex systems. Any more questions? So should I move to the next one? Maybe the last one. Yes, I think. Oh, sorry. Anybody raising a question? I didn't know. Just a moment. What happened? Am I here?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I had lost connection. Sorry. So, any more questions? No. So we should move to something's happening here. Just a moment. Okay, last talk will be production of English clusters by Brazilian speakers, effects of orthography, phonological environment, and task type. Wellington Araujo Mendes Junior, are you here?
Yes.
So please, can you share your screen?
Okay, can you see it?
So yes, so Wellington, you are going to give the closing talk of this meeting. So enjoy your time.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Wellington Mendes. I'm a PhD student of linguistics here at UFMG. And today I'll talk about the production of English CS clusters by Brazilian speakers, focusing on the effects of orthography, phonological environment, and task type. By the way, I'll be pronouncing CS clusters just for the sake of brevity. Actually, the C represents a stop consonant, and the S represents a sibilant that may vary in different degrees of voicing. And also bear in mind that this is just part of an ongoing PhD thesis. So the results you're going to see are part of a pilot experiment. So as it is widely known, English plural suffixes and also third-person singular present forms are subject to a phonological phenomenon. So basically, if a word ends in a voiceless consonant, it takes this plural suffix, as in cups, cats, and dogs. But if the word ends in a voiced consonant, a vowel, or a diphthong, it takes z, as in dogs, trees, and pies. But if the word ends in a sibilant or in an affricate, it takes is, as in buses, quizzes, and watches. However, when we take a look into English orthographic patterns, we notice that there are two possible spellings associated with these sound patterns. So basically, words can end in a consonant followed by as in books and jobs. And they can also, words can also end in a consonant followed by as in cakes and cubes. But Brazilian Portuguese, on the other hand, presents a single orthographic pattern associated with those forms, which would be the CES, as it happens in clubs, shacks, or pots. And this single orthographic pattern is associated with alternating forms as clubs and clubis, in which a high front vowel may or may not be pronounced before the sibilant. So we wanted to assess whether this ongoing sound change in Brazilian Portuguese could perhaps influence the production of L2 English forms. And we also wanted to assess how learners would process these different orthographic and phonological patterns. Could they perhaps clash with each other? So our aims are twofold. First, we want to investigate the production of CS clusters in English by Brazilian speakers, focusing on the potential insertion of an epenthetic vowel. And we also want to assess how orthographic and phonological representations are related. The main question we posted was whether different orthographic patterns trigger different pronunciations of plural forms in L2 English. But how did we get here? Well, basically work on the past tense showed that Brazilian Portuguese speakers tend to insert an epenthetic vowel between two stops word finally. So instead of saying something like moved, they would say moved or robbed. And these works that I've listed here by De La Torre, Silveira, and Gomes, they mainly state that this occurs due to effects of not only the orthographic patterns, but also the visual presentation of the words, and naturally the time of exposure to the L2. But on the other hand, works that focus on the present tense and word final sibilants did not account for the role of the epenthetic vowel. They were rather concerned on voice agreement. So they wanted to assess, for instance, if a word such as house would be pronounced with a word final voiceless alveolar fricative, whereas a word such as keys would be pronounced with the voiced counterpart. And why did they assess this? Basically because in Brazilian Portuguese, word final alveolar sibilants are prone to regressive assimilation, as opposed to English, in which they are prone to progressive assimilation. So according to both Zanfra and Fragoso, some non-target forms arise due to the transfer of a phonological behavior from the L1 to the L2, which would be the regressive assimilation property. However, neither Zanfra nor Fragoso accounted for the potential influence of an epenthetic vowel to voicing, and neither did they account for the different degrees of voicing of the final sibilant. And as it is known, in English, the word final sibilants, actually sibilants in general, they are only voiced in, they are only fully voiced between vowels. In other environments, they are only partially voiced. So this is what we wanted to assess as well. Our theoretical background is basically grounded on the exemplar model in L2 phonology, which has already been covered here previously. It accommodates assumptions of the exemplars theory and the revised speech learning model. And it considers the role of detailed phonetic information besides connecting orthography to linguistic representations. As you can see here in this diagram, which was designed by Thais Christopher and I, the exemplars, which would be the gray boxes, they are directly associated with the orthographic forms, which are also associated with different sound patterns during plural formation in a sort of network. As for the methodology, we worked with a group of 6 high school students who displayed intermediate levels of L2 English. An experiment was designed to assess the production of plural nouns, both in L1 Brazilian Portuguese and in L2 English. We worked with a picture counting task, as you can see here on the left. So learners had to not only name the word, but also count how many elements they would see on the pictures. And we also worked with a reading task, as you can see 2 examples on the right. Another thing we wanted to do was to find a way to properly measure voicing. So I came across with the concept of harmonics to noise ratio, which basically measures the relation of voicing to friction, the additive noise. So it can only be used reliably to measure fricatives and other sounds that contain some sort of turbulence. Here in this line, you can see the relationship between H&R and voicing. So harmonicity is measured in decibels. Basically, an H&R of 0 decibels means that there is equal amount of energy in the periodic and in the acoustic part, whereas an H&R of 20 decibels means that 100% of the energy, the additive energy, is in the periodic part, and thus the sound would be fully voiced. This technique seems to be aligned with other methods that measure fricative voicing, such as these ones. And I've selected H&R because of how practical it is to measure it in prot. So basically I had to extract the focus domain as a separate sound object, create a harmonicity object in prot's main screen, then select periodicity to harmonicity. And finally, I would perform a query and get the means. Those steps are available in prot's official manual, and they can also be automatized. Now, as for the results, this chart shows us CS rates by orthographic patterns. So we had Brazilian Portuguese CES, English CES, and English CS patterns. When we take a look into Brazilian Portuguese CES, we can see that 62% of the tokens were associated with non-epenthetic productions, whereas 48% of the tokens consisted of epenthetic sequences. So that means that CES clusters are emerging in Brazilian Portuguese, and they, in terms of representations, probably they are the robust pattern. And well, in terms of phonological theory, possibly those patterns would be transferred to L2 English as well. So when we take into account the English, both English orthographic patterns, we notice that the CES orthographic pattern displayed 83% of non-epenthetic clusters, whereas the CS sequence displayed 96% of non-epenthetic clusters. So CS orthographic pattern displayed only 4% of epenthetic vowels. And when we compare both English orthographic patterns, we notice that there is a significant difference between them. And this suggests that somehow orthography plays a role in L2 production, and that orthographic information is part of phonological representations as well. However, no significant differences were found between the picture counting task and the reading task. And this was a very striking result because it suggests that regardless of the visual presentation of the words, the orthographic patterns are pre-activated and somehow they carry on in the learner's cognition. Now, when we consider voicing rates of the final sibilant in L2 English, this table shows that when we expect a S, we do get a S at very high rates, actually. But when we expect a Z, we still get a S at very high or moderate rates. And when we get a Z, it's actually because of the presence of a vowel in the following word, or because of the presence of an epenthetic vowel preceding the sibilant, or even because of both an epenthetic vowel preceding the sibilant and a vowel following the sibilant. So in short, this indicates that learners do not voice because they know the rule or the voicing property, the assimilation property in English, but rather because of the transfer of phonological behaviors from the L1 to the L2. So it's not only about the sounds that they transfer, but rather the phonological environments, the patterns that they take to the L2. So another interesting result we found was that learners not only tended to not voice the final sibilant, but they would also devoice the preceding stop. So instead of saying something like two bags are seen, they would say two backs are seen. So you can see that there is no presence of the voicing bar in the acoustic signal, even though the next word starts with a vowel. And this probably comes from Brazilian Portuguese because we found there were lots of data indicating that learners also tended to devoice the final cluster. So there is, as you can see, there is no presence of the voicing bar, neither during the production of the sibilant nor during the production of the preceding stop. So instead of saying something like redes argentinas, they would say redes argentinas. And it's interesting because they would even bypass contrast. So in Portuguese, they would say something like sets do governo instead of sedes do governo. And in English, they would say like sites instead of sides, and in other words as well. But since we didn't want to rely on the visual cue of the voicing bar, we measured harmonics to noise ratio. And this box plot shows us H&R rates per following phonetic environment. And we can see that when the sibilant is followed by a pause, H&R rates are lower than when it is followed by a vowel, indicating that probably there is an interference or an influence of the same pattern in Brazilian Portuguese. And t-test results show that there is a significant difference between both groups when the sibilant is followed by a pause and by a vowel. Now, this box plot shows harmonics noise ratio per preceding phonetic environment. And the groups are sibilants preceded by unvoiced consonants, voiced consonants, and vowels. And this vowel would be an epenthetic one. And we can see that when the sibilant is preceded by an unvoiced consonant, AGNR rates are lower than when it is preceded by voiced consonants and vowels. And ANOVA results show that there is a difference, a general difference between those three groups. Tuckey's post hoc test showed that there is a difference between unvoiced consonants and the other two groups. And this indicates that epenthetic vowels contribute to voicing of the final sibilant as much as preceding voiced stops do. And there also seems to be an interaction between the preceding phonetic environment and the following phonetic environment. And what does this tell us? Well, basically, we can conclude that plural formation in L2 English is influenced by orthographic patterns. So an epenthetic vowel is more prone to occur when the pattern is CES rather than CS. And this is aligned with other works that assess, for instance, the past tense productions in English. Visual access to orthographic forms did not influence a vowel to occur, suggesting that orthographic patterns have a permanent impact on literate individuals' mental representations. AGNR is strongly influenced by phonetic phonological environments, including preceding epenthetic vowels, which had not been accounted for in previous studies. ZA poses a challenge to Brazilian speakers of L2 English since it has no exemplars from L1, at least not in word final position. So the go-to choice of Brazilian speakers is actually to produce a word final voiceless fricative. And so thus they should be instructed about when to produce ZA in a word final position in English, and also the progressive assimilation rule that takes place in English. Robust patterns from the L1 are adopted in L2, including fine phonetic detail that reflects subphonemic properties. And this is clear when we take into account the fact that learners not only tended to devoice word final clusters in L1 Portuguese, but they would take this pattern to L2 English as well. So again, it's not only about the sounds that are transferred, but also the phonological behaviors as well. And finally, better generalizations are posted when plural formation is assessed globally, rather than accounting for epenthesis and voice in agreement as unrelated phenomena. So thank you very much. I would be glad to answer any questions. And again, I'd like to say that this is just an ongoing work. There are some limitations that I've already noticed. And also, if you have any suggestions, I would be glad to take them. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Wellington. It was a nice talk to close this meeting. We have now time for questions. Somebody wrote something. Let me check. Ronaldo, no, Ronaldo, just very interesting, Wellington. Any questions? So
I have a question.
Oh, Mariana, please.
Okay, I'm trying to turn on my camera so you guys can see me. Wait a minute.
That would be nice.
Okay.
I can
see
you.
All right. So Wellington, what do you think are the reasons for the word final devoicing in your data?
I think that Thais would be able to answer that question more properly. But I believe there are different layers of impact, such as like the loss of the vowel itself. It probably creates an environment that favors the disappearance of voicing, in the position of the cluster as well, since it's in an unstressed position. And as it is known, Brazilian Portuguese is prone to weakening processes in post-tonic environment. So probably there is like an influence of the post-tonic environment as well. Perhaps there are physiological influences as well, because it's like less effort is required when you don't voice your vocal folds than when you actually do. So perhaps there's like a physiological aspect to it as well. And I may be a little bold to say this, but perhaps there are historical effects as well, since word final devoicing is attested across some Indo-European languages as well, such as Dutch, German, Catalan, even English to some extent. So it wouldn't surprise me if Brazilian Portuguese was just around the corner, you know. But again, I think that Thais would be a better option to answer this properly, but unfortunately she's not able to attend this talk. But actually this is something actually this is something that interests me as well, but it's not really the focus of this work. Perhaps in the future we will have better answers and an experiment, a comprehensible experiment that may be able to understand this, because I think that this devoicing is not only taking place in word final position, but it's already happening in word initial and word internal position. I have discussed this a little bit with Thais, but it's something that I think further studies can explore more.
Can you, about this last thing, can you give us an example?
Of?
An example of this last thing that you said, the voicing in the beginning.
For example, jovens instead of jovens, or fagem instead of vagem.
Does it happen?
Yeah, I mean, if you pay a lot of attention, because I actually discovered this word final devoicing taking place in Brazilian Portuguese because I noticed that the L2 speakers were doing it in English. So I was like, they are not doing this out of nowhere. And then I paid attention to the L1 Brazilian Portuguese data, and I noticed and showed it to Thais, and we were really impressed that they actually do it, that they say sets instead of seds, you know. I would never imagine that they would do this. But then again, all my data is from Minas Gerais, and as we know, we tend to, you know.
Okay, in Minas Gerais, we speak the classic Portuguese. It's not a problem.
Thank you, Wellington.
Anytime.
No, so just a joke. But anyway, one thing that I was thinking here when you said about physiological reasons and the effort, we should always think that in the case of speech, we have two kinds of effort. We have the physical effort, and we have the complexity effort. So in most of the cases, at least that I can observe, complexity is something more important than the physical effort. But it's just a speculation. I'm not sure of what I'm saying, but intuitively, I would say that when we lower complexity in producing any utterance, it explains more of what we observe. What do you think? Well, complexity and physical effort. That's
well, honestly, I haven't given much thought to it, but honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, no, just a question. So, any more questions?
I do.
Okay, who? Sorry.
Maria.
Maria. Okay, Maria, please go ahead.
Well, Wellington, thank you very much for your nice talk. I'm not going to turn my camera on because my connection is very unstable today. But would you come back to the slide in which you present the H&R definition, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
this is just a brief comment. I think you could somehow make the second affirmative softer or something like that, because I don't think it's proper to say it can only be used reliably to measure fricatives, since this measurement, the H&R, it's used for other purposes as well, such as voice quality and many other things. It can be used as a measure of signal to noise ratio too. So maybe you should adjust this. Maybe you found it somewhere else.
Yeah,
too,
in Kiss's work,
yeah,
this one here, which is
yeah, maybe you should take a look at the context in which the author said it. Maybe.
Yes, sure.
Because we use this measure for other measurements too.
Okay. Yes.
And then would you come back to the H&R data?
Like the box plots?
Yeah. Okay. Which was your measurement unit? The whole fricative for
decibels.
H&R? No, but the unit, what you segmented and measured.
Oh, the word final fricative. Yeah.
The whole fricative.
Yes.
Because here, what you have is the following phonetic environment, right?
Yes.
You're measuring a fricative followed by a pause or a fricative followed by a vowel, right?
Yeah, right.
But what can happen is when you measure the whole fricative, sometimes even if it is a Z, but it's like before a pause, it can end like an S at the end, just because it will be followed by a pause. But it can start as a Z, you know? It can be partially voiced. It won't happen, or it will happen less if it's followed by a vowel, because it will tend to maintain voicing, you know?
Yes.
Maybe you can take a look and measure H&R at a part, at the first half, for example, the fricative. I don't know. That's just an idea. It's something for you to think about in your next steps. Because it's like you're measuring, making an average during the whole fricative, and you're losing this kind of detail.
Okay, maybe adjust the onset and the offset of the fricative, right?
Yeah, just think about it. Maybe you can find a solution that is better than the one I offered.
But it does make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So I think this was the last presentation, unless
Ronaldo has a quick comment.
Okay, Ronaldo.
All right, if there is time, it's just a very quick comment. Wellington, congratulations.
About this presentation, or about the meeting?
About the presentation.
So go ahead.
So Wellington, thank you for the very clear presentations. You have very interesting results. And it's just a quick comment here that interlanguage and then phonological interlanguage we're looking at, it's such a complex system, right? Because finding the causality in it is really hard, right? We can't always say what is causing what, because the interlanguage then becomes a system of itself, a being of itself, right? I was thinking here as you were in your discussion, so we have several elements of Portuguese interfering, and then elements that maybe are within the interlanguage, right? For instance, if you take the words is and his, and Brazilians devoice that final fricative, it makes sense, right? It's what we would do in Portuguese. And then you take words blouse and mouse, for instance, then Brazilians would voice that fricative and say blouse and mouse. And in the beginning, blousey and mousey. And then the empathetic vowel will make sense because in the fricative is between two vowels, right?
Yeah.
But in the regular development of English L2, or at least by Brazilians, they will very soon lose that empathetic vowel, right? Because it's something they notice right in the beginning.
Yep.
But they will keep the voicing of the fricative, right? So they will stop saying mousey and blousey, but they'll say mouse and blouse, even though it makes no sense in the point of view of the L1, not in the point of view of the devoicing tendency you were talking about, and even less from the orthographic influence, right? Because then if you think of mouse, if Brazilian Portuguese would interfere with it, it would be towards devoicing, right? Because mouse would sound closer to mice, for example, right? So it's very interesting to see that in the beginning, that empathetic vowel will force students to voice the fricative, but even when they lose that empathetic vowel, which is in the beginning, the first stages of learning, they will keep voicing that fricative until they are advanced learners, right? So,
yes,
I mean, you have interesting data, and what I'm saying is that finding the causality is very hard, right? Many times the reason is within the interlanguage, right? The interlanguage is a whole new system. It's not the L2, it's not the L1, and I mean, taking that into account is necessary, right?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Ronaldo, it includes me. This is the first time I hear that I should say mouse and not mouse. but the influence here is not phonetic. It's much more orthographic, because
orthographic. I agree.
Brazilians, we have S between vowels as a Z.
Right. Right. And things get worse when you have cognates. So you get words like fantasy, which resemble very much fantasia. Our Brazilians are going to say fantasy instead of fantasy, right? So you have orthographic influence, cognates, then the L1 system, and the interlanguage system itself, all of them interfering at once, right? So I mean, it's chaotic, complex, right? And I think it deserves investigation, and with a caution in when stating causality, right? But good work.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's now, what time is it now? 4:22. It's good that we finished in advance. We are now in the closing session. We have now time to discuss the meeting itself. When I attended the talks, I tried to put them in contrast. That one recurring thing that came up in this meeting is the point of language as a moving process, something that's evolving. Didier put it as well in a framework when he said that the time span is too short and languages change too fast if we think that 1,000 years is nothing. I will, so there is something in the chat here. Dear all, thanks. Antonio, sorry for my absence in sense of presenting research. Do not worry. You can comment, Antonio. That's okay. It's better. So, sorry, I'm going to use a Brazilian expression. It's better to be stoned than the glass. Right? So, but we have time to discuss. So anybody would like to start a discussion here? Eleonora, maybe? Or Rafael?
Well, I'd like to return to a question that I had no time to explain to Ronaldo, in a sense, on behalf of my student who was once his student, his master's student. We're not going to work with the same corpus because of the reasons you explained. There's too much background noise beyond any software. So we're going to do something more controlled, and we are looking at Ronaldo presented a paper that was based on the dissertation actually submitted by Alejandro Araujo, and was basically his master's thesis. And I didn't understand, Ronaldo, the vowel classification. If you remember that, because you don't have your PowerPoint here, please explain to me why palatal and anterior, why posterior. This seems a little bit messy to me. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
People dislike me.
No, don't worry. The answer.
Community, because I'm 100% sincere.
Don't worry, Eleonora. I appreciate the sincerity, and the answer is straightforward. I just didn't answer yesterday or the day before because of time constraint. But it's not classification for the vowel. One was for the vowel, so the anterior-posterior classification was used for the stressed vowel, and the palatal coronal classification was used for the preceding consonant.
Oh.
So it was not both classifications for vowel. It was one for the stressed vowel. The other one was for preceding consonant.
Oh, so you ran. It was a regression. No. What kind of model was it?
We ran a regression. It was a Bayesian hierarchical regression model.
Okay.
Yeah,
So that's
the one I
okay.
presented this week, right? But in Alejandro's work, it's a linear mixed facts model, but it's still a regression.
Okay. Okay. No, because I got mixed up when you exposed that, and of course I'll have to discuss this with Alejandro pretty soon. Thank you.
All right, sure, my pleasure.
Okay, sorry, I was with the microphone muted. Coming back to the last talk, I was curious. So, Wellington, you measured the harmonic to noise ratio, right? And I
Yes.
saw values that you obtained. How did you explain that in your talk? But could you tell us the meaning of that measurement? Does it really give you a good measure of voicing?
Well, I've read 2 works that compare harmonics to noise ratio results with other techniques that measure voicing.
What
Honestly,
would be the other techniques?
Like the ones that I've shown, like the spectral effects. I can like share here again.
Okay, here you have the harmonic to noise ratio.
Yeah, the low frequency spectral effects, center of gravity, pulse based measurements. So I don't know much about the physical aspects of it, you know, but those 2 works that I've cited here, they show that AGNR is aligned with other techniques that are also used to measure fricatives, only fricatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you say that 10 decibels would be a partially voiced fricative, but
yeah.
And you got depth measurements in that range. In the next, I think in the next slide you show it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like about 10, sometimes 12, sometimes less than that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
then I have some outliers with like 15, 16, 17.
Most of the time less than 10. So although
yeah, because the tendency is to produce voiceless fricatives.
Mm-hmm. That's so okay. That's it. One day it would be interesting to hear some of the examples, but I think hearing here would be, I don't know if it helps or not, but I can see the results. So it's now, unless we have any other comments, we could end this meeting now. I don't know when we are going to have a new Eicefala, maybe within 2 years, I don't know. We are in 2021. So maybe in 2023, with Eleonora less worried about other aspects of life. Hopefully. Yeah, okay, I got it. And in the next meeting, maybe I will think about the possibility of having a hybrid meeting, allowing, so many conferences are doing that now. They allow your physical presence and for those who cannot travel, a virtual presence in the meeting. I don't know if it's going to be a model or not, but that's an interesting idea. So during this meeting, we could see that we had people from abroad participating in the meeting, but we also heard complaints that, like even Eleonora, that if I were in Belo Horizonte, I would not be interrupted. I could stay all the time with you. And that's true. So we have advantages and disadvantages in the virtual and in the presential meeting. So Ronaldo wrote something here. I would love to be at UFMG in Belo Horizonte in 2023 for the next Eicefala. You will be welcome. And Bira, you will be welcome too. So if I understand that well, it means that the next Eicefala will be in Belo Horizonte. So, okay.
Sure.
And I will try, if we have if we have a physical meeting with everybody there, I will try to develop some way to have the thing with more demonstration and experimental framework. That would help a lot, I think. But it was a pleasure to be with all of you during these 5 days. I had problems too, so I could not be paying attention all the time, but I paid attention most of the time I could. Anybody else would like to say something before we end?
Henny, may I?
Yes, of course.
I would like to thank you for organizing the meeting. As usual, it was a great opportunity to talk to the colleagues and to see you all, even though we are virtual now. And I agree that the hybrid format could be a nice choice for us to be present, or even for people farther away from Belo Horizonte. I would love to be with you, but we don't know how things are going to happen from now on. And I don't know whether people are going to have money to travel. So a hybrid format.
People will have money to travel, but people will not have time to travel.
Yeah.
And when you said about the organizing committee, one thing that is important is that Maria Cantoni, Leonardo Araújo, they did most of the work. Magno helped a lot too. Leonardo is almost most of the time quiet, but he was fundamental. Without him, this thing would not happen. And Maria, she worked a lot to organize everything. So if we have an organization, it's thanks to them. Magno and I and Thais, we of course all of us helped too, but they were the main people in the organization committee.
And the organizing,
yes, you should appear.
And the organization was perfect. So thank you so much. But Henny, I meant when I said that maybe people don't have money to travel, I was thinking mainly on our graduate students. And maybe, I insist, the hybrid format would be a chance for them also to be present at the conference.
No, I like the hybrid format. Some people will not have time, some people will not have money. Rafael, Leonor wants to see your face. For some reason, yeah, okay. Leonor,
I have a suggestion, honey. We always took pictures when we finished the Eicefala. Maybe we could all turn on our cameras and take a picture.
Yeah, oh, that's a good idea.
That's right. We used to do that every year when we finished.
So please, everybody turn on your cameras. João Sansão is there too. I don't see him for a long time. Let me put myself in conditions to have a picture. So Adriano, if you can, Mateus, João, Lilian, Mariana, can you turn on your cameras? We need, so who is in condition? Let me take the first picture here. Okay, this is one. Mateus, are you there? João, are you there? Lilian, are you there? Adriano, are you there? João is there, so I'll take another picture. And 4 people. Okay. Okay. And I will send it in the chat if there is a way to do it. Archive. I can.
The chat disappears after the. Put it somewhere else.
Somewhere else, but where? Well,
I think more people turned on their camera, so maybe
yes,
should be
one
good
more.
idea.
Lilian, are you there, Lilian? You are the only one who's not. Okay. Lilian appeared. So now we have everybody. Thank you. Now this will be the official picture with everybody. So say
we can copy paste Thais later.
Say speech. Everybody, speech.
It's cheese, cheese.
But this is speech. We are doing so. Okay. So we have a nice photo now. I will send it to you in the chat, and by mail later. Just my computer, documents.
Put the figure in the website for the meeting.
I will do that too, but I'll put it here too. So for those who want to have it now, I'm sending it.
You know, okay. Henry, you have a print screen here, a print screen key, so you can take the picture as well.
I did. So you have you probably have it in the chat. You can download it. So if everybody downloaded, so okay, that was a very nice meeting, and I wish all those who didn't finish the master's or the PhD that you succeed in your defense. It's a nice time in the life of everybody because during the master's or the PhD, these are the times when we can put all of our effort to analyze a single problem. After that, you are going to have to divide your attention among maybe 20 or 35 problems. And just a question before we end. So, Bira, where are you now?
Porto Alegre.
Sorry, in which city?
Porto Alegre.
Porto Alegre. Eleonora is in Campinas. Maria is in Belo Horizonte. Ronaldo is in Fortaleza. Laura is in Porto Alegre. Okay. Rafael is in Grenoble. Vitor Hugo, where are you?
In Belo Horizonte.
Belo Horizonte. Leonardo is in Belo Horizonte or Ouro Branco?
Belo Horizonte.
Belo Horizonte. Adelaide is...
Cold and rainy Curitiba.
Okay, is everything okay there? You know that sometimes when I meet people, I tell about the stories that your husband told me when we met there.
Okay.
Joshua is in Belo Horizonte. Send my best regards to him.
Oh.
Zuleika is in São Paulo. São Paulo, so send hugs and kisses to Emmy. Thank you. Leonardo Teixeira is in Belo Horizonte? No.
Fortaleza.
Fortaleza, good. João, where are you?
Eu? Juiz de Fora.
Juiz de Fora? So,
Juiz de Fora.
Are you going to Ouro Branco in the near future? You don't know.
I don't think so.
Adriano, you are in Belo Horizonte or Cajuru?
I am in the big metropolitan region of Carmo do Cajuru today.
So who knows Carmo do Cajuru, for those who are not from Belo Horizonte? So Carmo do Cajuru, do you know Divinópolis?
No, and it's the other way.
Okay,
you know?
Divinópolis is in the Great Cajuru.
Yes.
The big Cajuru. And Mateus, Belo Horizonte?
No, I'm in southern Minas Gerais, in a city called Alterosa.
Alterosa, I didn't know it. Good to know. Close to where?
Alfenas, Poços de Caldas.
Okay, I got it.
This region.
And Lilian, where are you?
I'm in Lille.
Where?
I'm close to Rafael. I'm in Lille.
Ah, nice. I didn't know. Good to know it. So it's good. So good evening or good night for those who are in Europe. And I thank you all. Anybody would like to say something before we finish? So okay, Eleonora, please.
Just say good luck to all of us, and that this thing about CAPES has a happy ending. I sent a few people the documentation I have about the resistance to this arbitrariness.
I don't know if you know, but now I am the coordinator of the graduate course, the graduate program in neurosciences. So I'm following everything that's happening there too. Trying not to, the thing is completely crazy, but let's see what happens.
But there have been reactions all over the place. Let me ask you if it's true that UFMG has filed suit against CAPES, because someone at Unicamp heard this, but they could not confirm it. What I know is that the forum of social sciences, the letters, and linguistics, and the sort of thing, has written a very well argued letter the
letter that circulated in our forum is the one written by the CTC.
There's one above that,
So I'll check it out. But as far as I know, the CTC letter. So many people asked to sign that letter too. So my dog is asking me to finish. So
we have finished. Oh, my part.
Thank you very much. So goodbye, Rafael. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Millions of bye.
Bye bye, everybody. It was great.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Fael. Bye.
Bye.
Chama ele lá. Isso aí, gente. Obrigado.